Can you hear that? Can you hear it? Motherfucker. How do I do this? Sorry, guys. Hold on one second. $300,000 a day of oil. Make those producers find a market for that gas. Secondly, when you talk about waste, so these producers today in Midland, they're getting $16 for their barrel. As you talked about, for the waste for the state of Texas, our counties, our hospital districts, our severance tax issues for university lands that I serve on the board of, it's a waste of all of that, and our workers too. I mean, there's such a face to this downturn that nobody seems to care about, and that is our service company guys, that we're going to lose 30 to 40,000 people here in the Permian Basin when these rigs quit working. And to me, that's a tremendous waste of a God-given talent that cannot do anything else. That we're going to see go by the wayside for the next year. And so, again, back to your question, Commissioner Sitton, you see the waste of selling a commodity at an incredibly discounted price, when if we had any buoyancy at all of the price, it would be worth it for this state as a whole, and all of our taxes and all school districts and things like that.
Then go to the proration side. A lot of discussion today about 20, 25, 15, 20, 25 million barrels a day oversupply, even after far out of whack.
So, Commissioner Sitton, I would get with our Texas refiners. You're an engineer, I'm an engineer. It's a material balance equation. How much oil do they need, can they use from the Texas energy producer? They've got to bring in some foreign oil because it's sour. They got to bring in some from Canada. You work with these refiners on a monthly basis. You find out what our mix is that we can produce in Texas that they need, what they can import that they need, and then you work that through our Texas Rail Commission on a monthly basis. I don't know what it is. Our refiners know. They can talk to you about what that perfect mix is every month. And again, next month when they say, hey, things are picking up, people are starting to drive again and fly a little bit, and we go up another 2 or 3%. But they're going to be the ones that can tell you what it is. I don't think it's up to the commission just to pick an arbitrary number. I think all of y'all go out and talk with our refining complex, our exporting complex, and see what the happy number is. But again, I would sure want to do this sooner than later, because we need to do something to keep this foreign oil still coming in.
Let me ask that differently. I understand what you're talking about in terms of supply basis and refining demand and optimal blends. What I'm asking is, how would us prorating in terms of curtailing production, how would that affect, or how would that do something to address the waste issue that you were talking about if we were to prorate across the board?
Well, again, Commissioner Sidney, it would be equal pain felt by everyone. And so the tax lands that are coming after me today, if they can get the same price as the big independents on their oil, and I promise you, they're not given that opportunity right now. It's going to be a percentage across the board for what is needed in this material balance, and I can't answer that exactly what it's going to be, but it'd be up to y'all to try to find that out for the rest of us.
Thank you.
You bet.
Kirk, you mentioned in your written testimony a plan for enforcing production cuts in other countries. I hear you on limiting the international production by what we must have to meet the mix at our refineries. That's one. Are there any other suggestions that internationally we should look at or have the country look at?
Well, again, Chairman Christian, what I would do, this is where the United States is going to look to you three. And if you looked at this and said, okay, we can do this on our own, we can support our domestic need, and we can tell you what that is on a monthly basis, but you need to put a tariff on these refiners that import oil over that quota on a monthly basis. That would put a stick out there to not allow that to happen. And then the other conclusion that can come out of this right now is the North American equation. We have enough oil now in this country, in Mexico, and with Canada. Canada's exporting 4.2 million barrels a day to us right now. We could have an equation where we could do this on our own in North America. And again, what a fabulous deal if you three could address that and see and get that to our Trump administration and let them know how we could globally figure out how North America on its own can stand here, where again, we never have to worry about this imported oil doing this to us again. And we can then utilize our oil way more efficiently and a lot faster.
Thank you very much, Kirk. Are there any questions, members? Okay, thank you very much, Kirk. Appreciate your participation.
Thank you for letting me speak today.
Okay, before we take the next witness, Callie, let me just mention that we have had written comment from several of our current members of the legislature on this matter, and so far these members are against implementation, and they include Senator Paul Bittencourt, House Energy Resources Chairman Chris Patty, and House Chairman Charlie Guerin, and Lyle Larson. So I just wanted them to be recognized for having taken a stance on this issue. Okay, Callie, your turn.
Thank you. Jim Wilkes with Texland Petroleum, you are now invited to speak.
Mr. Wilkes, if you'd please just give us your name for the record, who you represent, and where you stand for, against, or neutral on this issue.
Mr. Wilkes, I believe you are still on mute.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. My name is Jim Wilkes. I'm president of Texland Petroleum LP, and I support proration. Commissioners Sitton, Christian, and Craddock, thank you for allowing me to present the views of Texland. Texland is a privately held producer in the Permian Basin with oil production of about 7,000 barrels per day. We've been in business since 1973 with headquarters in Fort Worth and a field office in Lubbock. We employ 73 people and operate 1,211 wells and 40 water flood projects. In all previous oil price downturns, we have always managed to sell our oil production and maintain operations at close to a break-even level. This COVID-19 crisis has presented us with issues that we have never faced before. Curtailment of production is already occurring in the field because purchasers are canceling our crude oil contracts with 30-day notice provisions. Our largest purchaser has asked us to reduce oil production by 15%. One purchaser canceled our contracts effective May 1st with no renegotiation for 2,000 barrels per day. Currently, we are in discussion with one of our purchasers about purchasing barrels where we currently have no contract in May and beyond. If we can't secure a contract or secure a market, we will be forced to severely curtail a number of our fields, regardless of economics, on May 1st. We certainly have concerns on how our wells will produce following a potential long shut-in period, because we have no previous experience with this. Some wells may take time to recover to their previous production rate, and some may never recover their previous rate. I'm sure that many producers are having their crude oil contracts canceled by their purchasers. We've experienced different treatment based on the type of purchaser. Refiners and true midstream companies have curtailed purchases, while large producing companies with gathering and purchasing arms have outright canceled our contracts entirely. This forced curtailment may be affecting smaller companies differently from more integrated producers with their own pipeline capacity. If the Texas Railroad Commission were to temporarily prorate production during this crisis, we believe that the curtailment of production would be more fairly distributed between small producers and larger integrated producers. Now I would entertain questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkes. That hurts to hear. That really does. It really does. Any questions, members?
Yeah, I've got it.
Commissioner Sitton.
Yes, sir. Man, Jim, I'm really sorry to hear about that. I did not realize y'all had been in business that long. Some of the comments we've heard today that forgive me, I'm going to ask you pretty bluntly here. Some people have said, look, this is supply and demand. The market's going to work out. Somebody said inefficient producers, they're going to have to exit the market. Maybe people said stuff like that. And forgive me, I don't mean to sound insensitive here, but can you respond to that? I mean, how does that relate to you guys?
Well, I feel like we're an efficient producer. We've been around since 1973, and we've managed to survive, every price downturn. But this one is so different, and the amount of demand destruction is incredible. And in our mind, we haven't done anything. We haven't done anything wrong to justify just canceling our crude oil contracts for May. And so we're left in a position now where we may not be able to produce certain fields, and we really have serious concerns about waste, and ultimate recovery, because we can't recover. These wells can't get back to where they were before. Long-term demand destruction. Long-term destruction of our reservoirs and our wells. That's a big concern.
Were you, but once again, going back to this idea of demand destruction, a lot of the conversation today about waste, were you offered lower prices for your crude that you couldn't afford, that you had to turn down? Or was it just flat out, we're just going to?
It was just canceled. No renegotiation. It wasn't a price issue or a gathering fee issue or anything like that.
I don't think I have any other questions. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Any other questions? Commissioner Craddock?
Jim, thanks for coming and testifying. You've always given us good information. So where I'm still struggling, and I'm sure because it's a stupid question, so you're going to answer it because I ask stupid questions all the time, and I appreciate you giving me good answers. Listen, if we were prorating, tell me how you think it would help you. If we started May 1st, how do you think it would help you? Would it give you access to pipelines? Would it make people negotiate with you? Will you specifically explain to me? That's where I'm missing the gap someplace on small operators, and that's why I'm kind of looking forward to you in the next few, so you can explain to me specifically how you think it'll help you if we prorate it. I'm missing something in my brain, so I'd love to understand that a little bit better.
Well, I think if you look at what proration would do, it's going to restrict production from everybody equally, presumably. And so that means that some of these markets that we've been cut off from would be opened up to us potentially, where we've had barrels canceled. By the way, ours is heavier sour crude, which we supposedly need in our refineries in the United States. And as opposed to the light sweet shale crude. So I believe it would open up markets to our crude that are not being served by others.
Okay. I appreciate you giving me that feedback. Like I said, it might be the dumb question. I'm just trying to figure out how it helps people. Do you think it gives you access to some additional pipeline capacity? Is that one of your issues as well, potentially?
Yes, additional pipeline capacity and possibly additional refining capacity.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that.
Let me kind of clarify that your explanation, because that made sense to me too. You're saying if the total is decreased on production, there's still going to be somewhat of a gap there in demand that you as a smaller person can now fill in that the larger
percentage, then I believe it would equalize the playing field between us and the larger producers.
Any other questions, members?
Thank you, Jim.
Appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Okay, moving on. I apologize if I do not pronounce this correctly. Case Vantahoff with Diamondback Energy. You are now invited to speak.
Thank you very much. If you please announce yourself and who you represent for the record, and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the issue before us.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, good afternoon, Commissioners, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. My name is Case Vantoff, and I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Diamondback Energy and the President of Viper Energy Partners, one of the largest mineral owners in Texas. I'm testifying today against proration for two key reasons. First, the free market is working, and second, the economic ramifications of proration. First, the global response to the oil market supply and demand imbalance is happening. The free market is working. Operators have cut CapEx, the rig count is dropping, and production has already been shut in due to economic reasons in Texas and abroad. Also, as mentioned, other states have not actively entertained regulatory intervention, placing Texas operators at a disadvantage. And around the globe, OPEC Plus have already announced a significant production cut. Fortunately, they did not make this cut contingent on cuts from Texas. To close this topic, the free market supply response is working in real time, and Texas should let it continue to work without regulatory intervention. Second, the economic impact of pro-rationing. In the near term, pro-rationing will have a more severe jobs and economic impact than the free market process. Using Diamondback as an example to play out how a pro-rationing order would be executed. If we are forced to prorate, then we are going to cease all activity right away, and Diamondback will not be using any service providers to drill, complete, or produce wells during the proration period. This directly impacts the employment of almost 3,000 people across all service lines that work for us today versus our current plans to keep them busy. I know the current reduction in activity is devastating to the service sector, but a 50% reduction in activity is better than a sector with zero revenue and zero employment. Now, the long-term impact of pro-rationing. Diamondback has set ourselves up to operate responsibly through economic cycles. We have low debt, a low-cost structure. We hedge our production. We've invested in long-haul pipelines and sales agreements to ensure our barrels move in both good times and bad. We have made conscious decisions to try to de-risk what is a very risky business and have made promises to our employees, service partners, and most importantly, our shareholders with this business model in mind. A pro-rationing order forces us to change our behavior and compromises these responsible decisions. What am I supposed to tell our shareholders who own the company that their investment has lost significant value due to regulatory intervention? Our shareholders have already expressed that this pro-rationing discussion has increased the cost of allocating capital to oil and gas operators in Texas. The damage has been done, but the implementation of pro-rationing would have devastating long-term effects to the value of oil and gas properties in Texas. To finish, pro-rationing is unlikely to have a stabilizing impact on the market. Physical flow, cash operating costs, and shut-in economics will dictate the stability of this market. But should pro-rationing be implemented and lead to higher oil prices, this will not help Americans. It will help oil and gas companies and executives. We are in the greatest economic contraction in recorded history. Why should oil prices rise? And what are we supposed to say to the 16 million Americans that have already filed for unemployment when it costs them more at the pump? For these reasons, I recommend the Commission dismiss the market demand hearing request. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, sir. Are there any questions, members? No questions this time. Thank you so much for what you do for Texas and Texans. And Mr. Sitton, I believe I'll have some.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I must be freezing up here. I'm waving like a chicken and nothing's happened. Sorry. Case, I've got one question. Thank you for your testimony. Yes, and thank you for your well thought out comments. Just before you came up, we had a gentleman from a small company, 7,000 barrels a day, who was essentially told it's not about price. We just don't want your oil. And I think his position was, it wasn't about efficiency of operation. It wasn't about cost. It was about size. I wasn't big enough for them to take mine. They're only going to take the big guys. Do you feel like in the end, that's just the market's working its way out? And if all the small guys go away, that's just the way it is?
I feel like, I feel obviously that size and scale are important and have benefited Diamondback, and we've made the decision to get bigger over time due to that size and scale benefit. But I'll look back in Diamondback's history. In 2012, we were producing 3,000 barrels a day, and we had firm transportation for up to 6,000 or 7,000 barrels a day to move our barrels through a pipeline. And we paid, tariffs on that 6,000, 7,000 barrels a day, even though we didn't have it. So, even a small operator can sign a long-term agreement, and the 30-day sales agreements are the ones that are getting canceled today because they're shorter term in nature and smaller in size. So, it is unfortunate that smaller producers tend to have shorter term contracts. But we've made conscious decisions to act responsibly at the Diamondback level to sign these long-term agreements.
One other question, Case. We've heard a lot of concerns, not just today's testimony. We've got a lot of reports and things about storage filling up. Do you guys, as y'all are planning forward, do you see storage becoming a problem, both from an industry perspective and when, and then what does that mean for Diamondback?
Yeah, no, certainly there's been a lot of good testimony from experts that know more about storage than I do today on storage filling up, in the U.S. But, this is a global market, and we have, 200,000 barrels a day of space on pipelines that point towards the Gulf Coast, and those barrels need to be exported. When Cushing fills and U.S. Gulf Coast refiners aren't taking U.S. crude, then that barrel needs to be exported.
When do you guys think we're going to run into a storage challenge, storage fill up, however you want to say it?
Yeah, with U.S. refiners cutting back on their runs and production not declining as quickly in the United States as maybe the rest of the world, we're probably, as the Plains experts and Enterprise experts said, we're probably getting closer to full storage, in the next month or two. But those barrels, need to move to Asia. For instance, our barrels today for our April loadings are going to be moving to Asia so that they can find a market. I'm not going to like the market price, but the barrels will move, and that's why we have this financial instrument called a hedge to protect us in these times. It's not fun. We don't like the price we're getting, but at least
said that I can think of today that if we prorate, y'all will just quit drilling. Can you expand upon why that might be the way your company would look at this?
Yeah, so today we're running a little north of 10 rigs. We're on our way down to 7 rigs, and we're producing somewhere in the range of 250,000 gross barrels a day. If we were forced to prorate down to 200,000 barrels a day, as the 20% mentioned earlier, we would not be bringing on new wells into that environment. So instead, we just shut in our existing production and we'd let all of our service providers and zero employment.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for explaining. Thank you, Mr.
You mentioned that there is a market for this to go to. Even if we fill the storage tank, there is a market in exports that then would take over at that point.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner, Mr. Chairman, the global market, the floating storage and the the ships that we're leasing in the Gulf Coast today, those barrels will go to where the demand is. And unfortunately, global demand is very, very weak right now. But there are areas of the world where demand is returning and strategic purchases are being made of our crude globally. While U.S. refineries are down, we need to get our barrels on the water and export our barrels, which fortunately we can do now in this country.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for taking time to visit with us today. We appreciate so much your testimony.
Thank you.
Callie?
Moving on to the next speaker, we have Don Sparks with Discovery Operating.
Mr. Sparks, if you'd please identify yourself, who you represent, and if you're for, against, or neutral on the subject at hand.
My name is Don Sparks. I'm a petroleum engineer and chairman of Discovery Operating Inc., a private independent oil and gas drilling and production company established in 1973 in Midland, Texas. I am for proration to properly reduce and apportion production between both large and small companies. I entered the industry in 1962 when the Railroad Commission used proration to help maintain proper balance between supply and demand of oil and gas to prevent the state's oil and gas resources being wasted by low pricing during times of low demand. By the mid-1970s, OPEC was controlling the price of world oil products. With the amount of oil and gas production available in Texas today, we should be involved in the balancing of the supply and demand to again prevent the waste of valuable Texas resources. Proration should signal Texas' willingness to help balance that market. The use of proration is the only way this can be done to have a fair apportionment to allow all Texas producers, both large and small, to have access to the market. As storage fills, smaller producers will be squeezed out of access to the market without proration. Proration will also is a way to protect the reservoirs from possible damage with complete shut-ins of the wells instead of allowing wells to be choked back to help balance the market. I have one other comment, which I would just recommend to the Railroad Commission. I think they should encourage the governor, who has already declared Texas in an emergency health situation, to declare Texas oil and gas industry to be in a force majeure situation.
You can't.
In doing so, he can prevent least problems during long shut-in times as we may be facing. That is the end of my comments, and I'm open for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sparks. Are there any questions, commissioners?
Yes. Yeah. And I would actually like to ask Don the same question that Commissioner Craddock asked. We're looking at this from a waste perspective, right? And can you articulate how proration at the Railroad Commission helps us and you avoid waste?
Well, for one thing, I think anytime you shut in well bores and they're shut in for a period of time, I think the reservoirs are damaged. We've had periods of times when we've had to do some of that, and the wells never came back to what they previously produced.
Bam.
I don't think that only time could tell you that, but I believe every reservoir that's shut in for, depending on the period of time, can be damaged by being shut in. The best way for us to protect our reservoirs and therefore prevent long-term damage to those reservoirs is being able to continue some type of production, even if it's pinched back using a choking system, to allow that reservoir to continue to produce, even if it's a lower amount. In addition to that, let's just face what we're talking about. All the taxes, ad valorem taxes, severance taxes, all those things that we discuss, when you're selling your crude at $16 a barrel or $20 a barrel, whatever it is, as far as I'm concerned, the more you produce that comes out of Texas, the more you damage the economy of Texas in the long term.
On that last point, Don, did I understand right? You're saying that selling crude oil at a really low price today versus a higher price down the road is that's the waste. Is that what you were getting at?
That's exactly what I'm getting at. That damages the state by reducing the value of the resources that we have in this state.
Good. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Craddock.
So Don, so maybe you have a memory or can tell us or can think about this. If we decide to proration, serious, it's kind of goes back to what I started with this morning. We don't know how to do it at the agency anymore. We haven't done it in a long time, and that's part of us having this conversation. So some of my questions are, and we got an answer this morning from Scott. You know, we start at January 1st. Where do we start? How do we start? Have we historically limited across the board? What kind of data do we need to make sure we have that it gives us information for everybody? And historically, as you might recall, you had to come in monthly. So we'd have to have some kind of hearing process, is my understanding, monthly. Can you do you have any recollection at all? Or can you think about it and get back to me about how this has worked historically and how would be a good process for us? And does that, I don't think we really know the right answers to that.
Well, I think the way Scott mentioned it this morning with a percentage on some type of field basis would be the way to go about it. Whenever I came into the industry, it was prorated. You could produce eight days a month, and that's the way it was done at that point in time. In my opinion, that was not the best way, because I've just been telling you, shutting in wells and leaving them shut in and then trying to produce them 8 days a month. I just don't think that's the best way. I think choking them back to where they're peach back on a field basis and you prorate on the field basis is the way to do it. Before, whenever I came into the industry, the fields, all the wells, you had 8 days to produce in that field.
Okay. Well, that answers part of my question. So I appreciate your feedback on that. Thank you.
Mr. Sparks, just one question. You mentioned earlier us suggesting the governor declare a declaration. Can you go for us non-legals, how that would benefit you as a producer, and what particular we're looking at the declaration of the governor and how it would benefit you?
Well, most leases, all the leases we have, but most leases all have force majeure, whether there's zero production coming out of that lease during that force majeure time, that lease cannot be lost. And that should put at least every mineral owner, and especially for small producers, if they don't have the access to market, their leases could be shut in. We don't even know how long this is going to last. And it's not right for them to lose their lease because of the force majeure. Now, you could go to the courtroom and probably win that with what's going on right now. But my point is, why should we have to go to the courtroom? And if the governor will declare that that's the situation with the oil energy, the Texas oil and gas industry now, that will prevent anybody that were to have that situation having to go to the courthouse to make sure his lease is still intact.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that very much. Makes sense. Any more questions, members? Kelly?
Thank you. We now have Stephen Pruitt with Elevation Resources. You are invited to speak.
Mr. Pruitt, if you would please identify yourself, who you represent, and whether you are for, against, or neutral on the subject at hand.
Mr. Pruitt.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Christian, Commissioner Craddock, Commissioner Sitton, for holding this open hearing and for allowing us to testify. I'm Steve Pruitt, CEO of Elevation Resources, a Permian Basin oil producer based in Midland, and I'm for exploration. The level of global economic contraction and the results of petroleum product demand destruction is unprecedented. To state that the U.S. oil industry has responded to downturns before without regulatory intervention and that we'll overcome this one is disingenuous given the magnitude of the oversupply and the pace of inventory growth. Estimates of oil demand destruction we've heard today range from 20 to 30 million barrels a day in what was already an oversupplied market prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. President Trump personally intervened with the Saudi and Mexican leaders this weekend to salvage the OPEC Plus cuts announced on Sunday by pledging the U.S. would make up for Mexico's disappointing 100,000 barrel cut, while offering another 250,000 barrels of cuts from the U.S. without any details of how that's going to be achieved. The 9.7 million barrels a day production cuts assumes that the G20 members, including the U.S., will curtail another 4 to 5 million barrels per day. And as you know, the U.S. is by far the largest oil producer in the G20 at 13 million barrels per day in Q1. The issue at hand is not whether the U.S. will cut oil production, but how and when. While it's happening at an operator level, including ours, based on well production economics, reduced or eliminating drilling and completion activity, and curtailment by oil purchasers, our president needs more tangible commitments sooner rather than later in order for OPEC Plus to maintain their combined cuts of 5 million barrels a day through June 30th. The aggregate cuts then dropped from 9.7 million barrels to 7.7 million barrels a day in the second half of this year, and further yet to 5.8 million barrels in Q1 of 21. These declining cuts are not nearly enough to balance the global oil markets and supply and demand, much less start to draw down record global inventories. This is a Texas problem that the Railroad Commission is uniquely empowered to address. And with Texas leadership, other states will follow suit. As we read this morning, Oklahoma is discussing what it can do to curtail production in its state. And the local lobbying groups are on board. Oil storage in Texas and Cushing will be full by mid-May, according to Plains and other sources. Oil demand in our refineries is off by 30 to 40% when they should be running all out to build gasoline inventories for the summer driving season that won't happen this year. Gasoline demand's off 50% year over year, and jet fuel demand's off greater than 70%. I was a petroleum engineer in the 80s bust and ran independent oil companies starting in the mid-90s and today. And this just stands apart from other contractions due to the confluence of excess supply overlaid with the global economic coma caused by the COVID pandemic. In none of those prior downturns was oil storage full. In current dollars, oil prices bottomed out at $26 per barrel in '86. $19 per barrel in 1999 per the EIA. Oil marketers are estimating $10 to $15 oil prices in May and effectively zero in June for the last barrel to get sold on the spot market. I urge you to evaluate oil market conditions and fulfill the Railroad Commission's duty to prevent waste and market destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pruitt. Any questions, members? No questions of Mr. Pruitt?
Yes, sorry. Wait, it just takes me a second to unmute, so sorry. Steve, thank you for your testimony today. Trying to wrap our heads around this idea of waste, and especially for the small, mid-sized producers like you, the question is, I just ask it simply, can you kind of quantify how you see waste, and if we were to prorate, specifically, how does that affect waste? Whether it's specifically through your company or outside, industry-wide. I mean, give us some context of that, please.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Sitton. First of all, waste I view as an economic waste. I think Scott Sheffield said it well. If the best in class F&D cost plus lifting cost and all-in cash cost is $26 to $29 a barrel, we are selling crude well below the cost of replacing it. So it's economic destruction. And some companies have done that voluntarily. Even with $50 oil, their refining cost and raw cash costs were higher than that. But now we're talking about the lowest increment of supply in the Permian that's impacted with what could be single-digit oil prices, or even the oil prices we're being quoted now at $15 a barrel. We are, as Don Sparks put it, selling oil and destroying the economics of this resource we have in Texas by selling at these prices. And, the remedy is that with coordinated curtailment, which President Trump saying could be 20 million barrels a day, I can promise you it won't be 20 million barrels a day without some tangible and regulatory-driven contribution for the United States. But without that kind of a cut, we will have single-digit oil prices for June and likely for July with storage full. As Jim Teague put it so well, whether storage is full or not, that incremental or that last barrel is going to find its way to market, and it's going to be at a very, very low price, like we've seen gas sell for negative prices. So without Texas leadership, I believe this OPEC plus arrangement ends up dying on the vine, after July 1st, and we're going to see many months of sub $30 oil prices and basically destroying the U.S. oil infrastructure.
That's all I have. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Commissioner, for all you do.
And actual physical hardships of delivery supply. And I think the Railroad Commission, if I'm not mistaken, having talked with our council in the past, are legitimately both of those, whether it be economic or physical structural supply issues, are both relevant to the discussion at hand. What's your opinion on that? Are they not both a consideration?
I think both are a consideration. On the physical side, look, we have adequate production facilities. There's adequate pipeline capacity, as the Plains representative, Mr. Bafanis, represented. It's the storage, the bottlenecks in the storage, and ultimately the refining, and ultimately the consumption of the product, which is going to be pressed for some time to come. So Commission's jurisdiction and prevention of waste really is both on the economic destruction, which will lead to massive bankruptcies, both for oil field service companies and E&P companies, and it's for the physical concerns with regard to full storage and product not finding a home, so to speak. And eventually, even as Diamondback's CFO, Case Van Hoff, said, ultimately those Asian markets fill up too. I mean, there's 1.3 billion barrels of remaining storage, and ultimately the Chinese will buy all the cheap crude they can, and at some point they'll have to stop buying. So exports are going to be a problem too.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
I have a quick, Steve, when you're talking about small producers, what do you consider a small producer in today's world?
Well, I think the commentary bifurcated that pretty well as I studied it last night. And, Jim Wilkes makes 7,000 barrels a day. We make 5,000 barrels a day. We're a small producer. We're not like the mom and pop company that makes 200 barrels a day from 100 stripper wells. We've got institutional capital. We're fully hedged. I mean, we're going to keep our doors open unless this lasts for more than 2 years. But small would mean, in my mind, Commissioner Craddock, a company that doesn't have the scale to buy firm transportation or take an equity stake in a pipeline for hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's sort of, the bifurcation is sort of Diamondback, EOG, Concho, on up to the integrateds, and then small would be even some of the public companies like Laredo, that's going to testify later, that is now almost a micro cap company because they're trading almost at their debt levels. They're basically trading almost at zero because of the.
So you're looking at it based on their capital, not based on necessarily the barrels they're producing, right?
That's right. But on the same token, I'm willing to do my part, and we already have. We've shut in wells. We've ceased to drill. And our production will be off 33% from its peak in January by the time we hit June. It may be zero if we're cut off because our term contract was terminated due to force majeure from a refiner, and now we're month to month, and we haven't received notice. We can still move our crude. But it's really more driven by the ability to access or participate in the mid and downstream areas, which most of the smaller independents cannot do.
Okay, so let me ask that when you say you'll have already cut 33% since January. If we start with January numbers, which is what was proposed at the beginning of the day, and then we tell you to cut 20%, and you've already cut 33% by the time, say, we start this or whatever, how are you not going to get double hit? How does that work for you as a small producer? Are you willing to take another 20% and be at 50% off to survive? I mean, I'm trying to understand we don't double hit you when we start. What should be the day we start?
Yes, Commissioner Craddock, as I understood it, so January is the benchmark, or maybe it's Q1, which Scott Sheffield testified Q1 is going to be higher than Q4. Q1 is the benchmark. Just pick on a number of 5 million barrels a day, and for us it's whatever it is, say it's 5,000 barrels a day. We'll be starting from that, frankly, that high point for the industry in Texas, and then be measuring against Q2 and then ultimately Q3 to fill in our report card for the rest of the world. And we will have started at the high water mark before COVID-19 and before the Saudis' action, and although capital discipline was in progress. So we'll start at a high water mark. So it's not as severe as you indicate. I think it will just be 20% off the high water mark. So we'll actually be 13% beyond what you all would require of us.
Okay, all right. And let me ask this too. I know you're mostly a Texas operator, but are you seeing, I know that we'll get you connected with Mark Hauser later, but I'm assuming you're out there reworking with your landowners and other mineral owners to try to rework your contracts as well. Yes, that's part of part of your operating process, right?
Yes, our sole mineral owner now is University Land, since we've consolidated and focused all of our activities in our most profitable field at Andrews County. And University Lands has always been and continues to be very commercially pragmatic and understanding of our role, our liquidity through this. Just as a fact, our neighbors are XTO and Oxy and Diamondback and others, but it was a small independent like us that established a new oil play in the Barnett Shale, and we're still drilling it. It works at $30 a barrel. It's got $2 lifting costs, so it's not like we're a marginal producer that needs to go out of business. We have production that should get dispatched at $10 a barrel, but because we don't have pipeline or storage access, we might get cut off even though our crude, warrants being produced.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, and thanks for giving us comments. I appreciate it.
And thank you.
I had one follow-up question, please. There's something that, as Steve, you were answering Commissioner Craddock's questions, it sounded like what you were saying was you had firm capacity, firm takeaway contract, but it was canceled due to force majeure. So it wasn't like it was just a short-term contract. It just got canceled because there wasn't enough place to take it.
Yes, the oil was going to the Borger refinery, and they're basically running at turn down volume, and we're kind of at the end of their pipe, and they just don't need our crude. And, I'm not going to sue P66. We were fortunate to find another transporter. The crude's going to Midland Tank Farm now, and we should have deliveries in May, but any day they can call us and say, our purchaser, which is Energy Transfer, cut us off, and sorry, we're done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Pruitt, thank you very much for your testimony and your good work employing the citizens of the state of Texas. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman Christian. Thank you for your service.
Okay, moving on. Next, we have Dean Foreman with API. You are now invited to speak.
Mr. Foreman, if you'd please announce your name, your affiliation, and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the item at hand. As soon as we unmute.
Mr. Foreman, it looks like you're still muted.
Hi, my name is Dean Foreman with the American Petroleum Institute, and we are not in favor of proration.
Please testify.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of API and its 620 members across the value chain. I'll offer you perspective based on having spent 15 years in Texas, 1 in Saudi Arabia, and 4 each in Western Canada, and now Washington, D.C. If you please turn to slide 2 of the testimony. I'd like to summarize my key points from the written testimony and contribute from API's latest monthly statistical report. If you'd advance, please, 1 slide. Thank you. So this will also speak to Commissioner Craddock's opening statement about needing good statistically valid data here. As you know, API is a primary data source on U.S. petroleum markets, and we survey some 90% of the industry each week and publish monthly estimates 2 months ahead of EIA. Here's what we see now. The current imbalance between oil demand and supply is largely a demand-driven problem, yet most of the policy solutions being discussed, including this hearing today, are targeting supply. Between February and March, total U.S. petroleum demand fell by 900,000 barrels per day. This is consistent roughly with what EIA sees as well. Gasoline and jet fuel were down, while diesel was up. Freight transportation by road and air has remained important. Now, these are large numbers, but they're less alarming than what many of the third parties that you'll hear today and have heard so far today have said based on top-down analysis. Now, turning to supply by API estimates, U.S. crude oil production and refinery throughput both fell in March, while crude oil inventories rose. Coupled with the U.S. Department of Energy's action on crude oil storage last Thursday, there should be roughly 100 million barrels of crude oil storage available. In short, market demand, supply, and stocks appear to be responding flexibly and appropriately. Next, we look at how Texas proration might work if administered at the field level. Based on API's analysis of production and allowables across all producing wells in Texas, we see it reducing the most from the fields, basins, and operators with the greatest production. The Midland Basin and Eagle Ford, their operators and royalty owners would be disproportionately affected. And we urge the Commission to understand if there may be long-term implications for unconventional well productivity in the state if there's severe proration or extended shut-ins. Now, if Texas prorates oil production, we ultimately see no benefit for Texas with OPEC's poor record of compliance and known sources coming on stream the next couple of years of non-OPEC growth. And this risks a slippery slope here. For example, Alberta, Canada is an object lesson in what not to do. Alberta thought it was implementing temporary measures at the end of 2018, but a year and a half later has increased curtailments and seen its oil trade at relatively lower prices than before curtailments began. To summarize overall, in the latest actual data, we see sources of resilience and remain confident that demand will rebound as the effects of COVID-19 diminish. And Commissioner Sitton, to your specific questions, we're seeing supply adjust to meet demand. Much as Todd Staples of Texoga reinforced, this is a somewhat self-calibrating exercise, and the market appears to be working effectively to prevent economic waste.
Thank you.
Now,
this is the 3-minute mark. Commissioner, Chairman.
Please extend, complete your testimony.
Thank you very much. We need to correct the record on one thing. Commissioner Sitton, you mentioned that Brent was at a 40% premium to WTI. That price difference has narrowed over time, over 5 consecutive months, and we've had consecutive days recently where WTI has been at a premium to Brent as OPEC has discounted aggressively around the world. This is really important to the entire value chain through Texas. And if you prorate production, and if it had the desired impact even for a short period, that also works against the value chain and refiners and downstream throughout Texas. So unintended consequences are important here. Now, the request made for Texas today to join OPEC, to have discriminatory proration across producers, and even government price controls, this would be a major setback we see for Texas. The U.S. needs Texas to be prepared to ramp back quickly, and prorating production would sell Texas short. So I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Are there any questions, members? Mr. Sitton.
Yes, thank you, Wayne. Dean, I appreciate the data. I'm about to geek out a little bit, so be patient with me. In your first, I'm trying to understand the supply-demand scenario right now. U.S. total petroleum demand of 19.4 million barrels a day decreased. So do I understand right? 19.4 million barrels a day decreased by, that was what, January, decreased by 0.9 million barrels a day to February, then 0.8 million barrels a day to March. So would that mean that as of right now, we're at 1.7, you're saying we're at 17.7 million barrels a day of petroleum demand?
No, sir.
As of the end of March?
As of the end of March, we are at 19.4 million barrels per day, down from 1 year ago in March, 20.2 million barrels per day. It's been a 4% decline. And of that, motor gasoline is down 10.6% year on year. Jet fuel is down 18.3%, and we could unpack that a bit. Diesel is only down 1.3%. There's been a big offset with the need for road transportation here.
Okay, so all right. So this, sorry, I was not following the line. Sorry, so 19.4 million barrels a day. That was just 2 weeks ago. And is that oil demand? In other words, the U.S. isn't using 19.4 million barrels a day of petroleum. Am I correct? We're exporting a chunk of that. So is that to the refineries, or is that petroleum product output?
No, sir. That's absolutely domestic demand. We have 8.2 million barrels per day currently of gasoline, 1.4 of jet fuel, 4.1 of diesel, about 0.1 to 0.2 of residual fuel oil. And then we've got another 5.6 million barrels per day of naphtha, gas oil, intermediates, middle distillates that go into refining and petrochemicals. So that adds up to 19.4. And then we export on top of that another almost 9 million barrels per day between crude oil and refined products.
Okay, so that's why you said petroleum demand versus oil. I'm trying to get the numbers straight. So our national refining capacity is around 19 million barrels a day. Is that correct? At the top side?
Yes.
And so
our throughput was right under 16 for the month.
Okay, so of the oil that's being produced in the country, so if we could help me out here, bear with me. I'm not a PhD economist, so I'm slow on the uptake here. We got you said it was about 16 million barrels a day in March. And if the United States is producing or was producing 12.5 million barrels a day of crude oil imports for this, what's the differential between crude oil production and total imports compared with refining demand?
Well, our refining demand for the month was 15.9. We produced, and consistent with the EIA, we saw crude oil production come down and slightly down on natural gas liquids. But when we add up total liquids, we've got 12.9 of crude oil. We've got another almost 5 million barrels per day of natural gas liquids. And with refinery gain and other things, biofuels, we've got another 1.2 million barrels per day there. So our domestic supply of liquids is over 19 million barrels per day. This is, I mean, we've got pretty robust supply here, and it's designed at this point with a largely saturated market to be export oriented. So as we've gone through the demand disruption that we've seen, I think it's important to underscore that Texas, and Mark Berg made this point on behalf of Pioneer early on, is saying we stole the market share. We didn't steal it. We've hard earned it, and Texas has earned it by being a low-cost producer with a really resilient system of producers, of infrastructure, of refiners that through this entire value chain have made this happen.
I agree with you there. As a matter of fact, I have spent some time studying this to realize at the end of the day, a lot of the value we have here is in the downstream sector, in the refining sector. So you're preaching the choir, and that it's because of that downstream effectiveness that we've created such demand for oil. What I'm trying to get to here is the oversupply. So if I'm following your math right, we're between 3 and 4 million barrels a day differential, and so fast forward to the question on waste is been today discussed. In fact, Chairman Christian just a minute ago was talking about the difference between economic versus physical waste. I think Todd Staples made the point that, look, we don't, it's hard to have physical waste these days because we've got such good controls, I think, of pipelines and storage and that sort of thing. So the question becomes economic. And several people today have said we shouldn't be worrying about economic. That's what private industry is going to work out. So if you don't mind, let me ask you from the supply and demand perspective and the oversupply, should we be concerned about the economic impacts of the oversupply and the potential filling up of storage? I mean, what are the economic impacts of that to the industry, state of Texas?
Well, respectfully, we've named some of the numbers. We also had some good discussion earlier about the role that imports play based on both the quality of oil being imported and the geography. And there are good economic reasons why that happens, but we still import the better part of 9 million barrels per day. And it so happens that we backslid as a nation in March, where we went from being, for a month or two, a net exporter of oil to slightly being a net importer again. And as we see crude oil production starting to respond and this come back, that's one of the potential costs to our nation of returning to being a net importer. From a producer's standpoint, so I wouldn't agree with the premise that there's this imbalance in that sense. I think you have to define, if you're going to define the market demand to match with supply and demand, there are some things that really aren't specified in statute or otherwise, and it becomes an art to interpret what's the timeliness of that, what's the relevant geography of that. And I think Lee Tillman said it really nicely and eloquently early on of talking about if we try to ascribe waste to every time that the market's in disequilibrium, it continues to move. In the long run, it is made up of many short runs here, and it's adjusting in some unprecedented but very healthy ways and resilient ways in the way we see it working. So these points that have been brought out through multiple pieces of testimony about having a portfolio and looking about how you as a as a producer, make a rational decision about where your margins are best. You heard from one of the producers that the Eagle Ford was one of the most attractive, and it would be like the last thing you'd want to shut in. If you're competing for capital, and if other states, they don't even have the regulatory infrastructure, much less even the authority in many cases to do what you're doing. You've got a very advanced and mature system for doing this. And I guarantee you, from Argentina to Guyana to Brazil to Norway, they are not shutting in if you do. So with those balances, you need to think that if you move unilaterally, you really are costing Texas competitiveness in terms of the dollars that are coming in, the jobs that are coming in, and the growth that's going out.
So it seems like and I realize I'm oversimplifying the question, your testimony here, but I'm trying to get to the idea. Look, we're trying to figure out if there's waste, and our statutory definition is production in excess of reasonable demand. I think what I hear you saying is that's not limited to Texas, which other people have said, and the nuances of the entire supply chain are really important. Understood. And at the end, look, Commission, it may not be your role to consider economic waste, because that is a nuance that has to do with global supply chain, global demand, global competitiveness. And so frankly, without considering all that, we can't, you have to consider all that. If you're not, then you can't make an effective decision. Therefore, going back to other people, we can't consider economic waste.
I really appreciate the way you're asking the question and grappling with it. It's great. Now, I would say in this way that this market is self-calibrating, it's working automatically to reduce both physical and economic waste. But if we went by just strict national, forget the timeliness of this and whether we want to look over a week, a month, a quarter, a year, if you just took strictly the March data, we were a net importer. So, on that basis, there is market domestically for Texas oil and for U.S. oil. It's just a question of how you're economically competing to place it in that market.
Some of the testimony that we've heard, actually just the last couple of presenters, talking about the small companies being at a disadvantage just because they don't have the volumes to maintain transportation contracts, those sort of things. Especially with, I'm not even comparing them to other U.S. producers now. I'm comparing them. If Texas, there's a 10,000 barrel a day producer in Texas versus a 12 million barrel a day producer who's government backed overseas. I hear your point as well. If you force the guy in Texas to cut back, I'm disadvantaging him even more. On the flip side, with the storage issues, so storage filling up and supply chain through storage in Cushing or Mont Belvieu, are there things that we can do to help protect the small producers versus the gargantuan international government-backed or government-owned producers in the world who present a pretty big threat?
Again, fantastic question and really thoughtful in terms of trying to salvage what is, we have to have some empathy here for the fact that this is a really difficult situation that's stress testing the business models within the industry. And inherently, you're right, it does tend to advantage the ones that have scale, that have firm transport, have storage capabilities that are integrated. And let's keep in mind, if we end up cutting back and trying to alleviate the situation globally, if you will, or take one for the team globally. Keep in mind that beyond this demand situation that Russia and OPEC have piled on here, that Saudi Arabia alone announced it was going to increase from 7.3 million barrels per day of exports in March to more than 10 million barrels per day by May. So the idea that they would come and say, no, Texas needs to play its part when they unilaterally put or announced that they would put as much as 3 million barrels per day onto the market. And that assumes that the logistics and the ship even exist for that to happen. But the market is moving on expectations here. It's moving based on not a lot of solid data. And that's why I think this monthly statistical report from API and EIA's data is really important here for grounding the fact that the numbers are not quite as alarmist as what many would think. As we see this, reacting to the way the market's actually playing out and having some sense of that, if there are, you heard Lee Tillman ask for flexibility with leases. There may be things that the state can do in soliciting approaches from a variety of producers and from the associations, from Texas Alliance to Texoga, measures on storage or aggregation that could advantage those producers. API, though we represent the entire industry and the entire value chain, we're not supplanting that role that Texas Alliance and Texoga play. But I think you could probably find out through the course of this proceeding productive things in state that could also help alleviate the situation locally. And that is the issue, is that SPR from a storage perspective, we say 100 million barrels per day of crude oil storage, 70 physically for commercial storage, and another 30 made available now in SPR to private entities by DOE last Thursday. It sits at the end of the system. That's not to say it isn't useful. It is, but you have to have the ability to get to it. So having a system that facilitates the efficiency of flowing that so it can be maximized in its use and the speed with which it can be filled could be beneficial to Texas.
If I could back up a little bit and think about, because I know API, you certainly not just a Texas organization, you represent oil and gas interests across the country. As we talk about the federal government taking a role, and I don't just mean negotiating or helping to bring Saudi and Russia together, but there's been calls from some pretty big oil companies for the federal government to help in a lot of different ways with financial support because of this unprecedented downturn. Some who have even opposed exploration here, but are looking for financial support. Does API support those kind of things, the financial support of companies, big companies that are struggling through this?
No, sir. We've been very clear that we, on principle for our credibility, stick with market principles, competitive outcomes, and have not asked for bailouts of any sort on behalf of our members. That said, we have a variety of members with a variety of business models, so we do discuss with them the variety of options that might be beneficial. At a federal side, there are a couple of things that have come up that we think are going to be helpful, and as the federal government comes up with proposals, we think our industry should not be left behind from things that help the overall economy. So on the Federal Reserve side, for example, the Department of Energy action on storage was one last week. The Federal Reserve, through the CARES Act, can purchase investment grade debt, and they just announced the other day that they'll also begin to purchase sub-investment grade debt. That could be of great benefit to the shale patch in particular. We'll see if they open a loan facility on the federal side. It's not something API is supporting or asking for, but that's something that inevitably would help the shale patch here. And if the U.S. shows an ability to backstop the shale patch, if Texas shows an ability to support the industry through this unprecedented tough time, that sends a message back to Russia and OPEC that the cost of this bad behavior of extending it will be exorbitant. So it's a win-win if you have a cohesive policy that supports the industry through this tough time.
Okay, one last question, and then I'll be done, I promise. We've heard a lot. We've got a lot of comments here from folks that are coming up. Other economists, Rystad, I think, Rapidan and Wood Mackenzie, and I've heard a lot of people talking. I mean, the conversation out there about storage has been quite vocal. When you look out there and say, does storage fill up, and does storage fill up or get close enough to it that practically there's no room for additional storage capacity? 2, when does that happen? And 3, what does that mean for U.S. production when that occurs?
Fantastic question. We can't micrometer it, and as API, we can't really predict it either. But based on the Q&As that you've had previously, where you've asked people about, is it July? We think based on just quantifying the fill, and keep in mind that crude oil storage normally, like 13 of the last 13 years in the U.S., crude oil has filled between February and March, and the amount of the exceptional fill is only around 10 million barrels for the month. So, when we've got upwards of 100 million barrels that fungibly could be used, And the question is, how long will that take? It's a minimum by our gauging of that of about 3 months, but it could go 5 or 7, depending upon what kind of supply response you see here. And it's interesting that EIA had projected that it would be not until May that crude oil production in the U.S. would begin to tip over, despite 16, 17 now consecutive months of lower drilling activity. And in our data, what we see and what EIA is now saying, that's been advanced by a couple of months with this precipitous drop off in drilling. So the more supply responds, the more that refiners are real time responding to these low prices and market conditions. There are more degrees of freedom in this system syncing up to the reality of the market that provide those sources of resilience to happen. So, look, the storage fill, it's a dynamic system, and we want to avoid taking static assumptions and just generalizing off of one data point. It's really important to see the system as a complex system that's evolving, and in these evolving times, the more degrees of freedom and local help you can provide, the better system will hold together.
My last component there was if storage does fill up, for whatever that means, what does that mean in terms of capacity issues? In other words, how does storage getting full affect the whole supply chain, therefore production?
Well, we've had times in the past when storage has gotten quite full, and people talk about, well, what's the next source of storage? And you've got physical storage onshore. People are reaching for ships for floating storage, and people get creative with finding a way to store those barrels rather than shut in. And it just, at some point, the cost of storage forces an economic trade-off where people do shut in, and you're seeing it locally, right? There's just because you've got that additional storage at the end of the system, if people can't get there locally, invariably there will be some shut-ins along the way here. We're seeing it. But that's the way the system works, and we're seeing these economic trade-offs being made real time. And I loved Commissioner Craddock's question about earlier about how do you avoid getting double hit? And the answer is you can't. I mean, regulatory uncertainty that actually gets interjected by a proceeding like this, where people might hold off on making that rational economic decision simply because they're hoping that they can spread the pain to others. That's not the most efficient outcome here. So the more expediently you can reinforce the way the market mechanisms are already working to solve this, the better.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Chairman,
he just said shit. I read his lips.
Like you're still muted.
His stuff is muted, guys. They're trying to get his attention.
Hey, Wayne, if you'll text it to me, I'll ask it.
I can hear you now. Well, I heard you briefly.
This is like Pictionary right now on his video feed.
Source. You're unmuted by host. Am I on now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. It was the host that did it, wasn't my button. Okay. I appreciate your questions. And here's something from the very first testimony, and this is a different situation that I'd just like to ask you the question. You're saying allow the free market to handle it. You're against us prorating this. But the first testifier mentioned that because of the size of the state of Texas and its production, that if we pass a resolution contingent upon OPEC doing this, or the federal government doing this, or other forces aligning, that was first presented rather than just flat doing a proration, say it's contingent upon the federal government doing this, OPEC doing this, OPEC. Should we even consider having in the scalpert for the feds for discussion a option like that rather than just a flat proration, to where it would be available for negotiating purposes that the state of Texas, if you do this, this, and this, and we join then. Am I making sense?
You're making perfect sense, Chairman. And again, a really intricate and thoughtful question in the sense that there's a part of my written testimony that goes into which is more sensitive to prices, Saudi Arabia or Texas. And there's a discussion of, in essence, when you go beyond oil and you start to look at a state level or a national level in Saudi Arabia's case of what the break even is, who's more competitive here? And I think you have to ask yourself, why would you? You've hard won this market share. You've got these resilient variety of entities that have led the world in technology and innovation, have forced a global market change, have shouldered all of global market demand for liquids for a couple of years now, and frankly continue to push the envelope here. And as in a sense, it really is rational if OPEC must have, from a budgetary standpoint, a higher price in order to subsidize its domestic energy, its public services. Texas wins here ultimately, and Texas shouldn't back off or let off the accelerator for that reason and start getting into this Alberta-like slippery slope. I think you're very well positioned, and it would be counterproductive and against market principles, and frankly fraught with a lot of unintended consequences if you go down this let's do something contingent on having a national deal. I can't see that one where that's going to, even if you get out from antitrust reasons, we're going back, and there's another part in the testimony that gets into what that looked like from the late 1920s through World War II. You've even heard some say, well, okay, let's look at having Texas estimate the refinery demand for different things in the state, and realize the complexity financially, the integration with petrochemicals through the entire value chain, the complexity of ownership. This is such a complex and fast-moving market, and frankly, Texas is killing it. You're absolutely leading it in the world. Don't let anything get in the way there.
Okay, thank you much. Thank you much, Mr. Foreman. I appreciate your very compelling testimony. I thank you so much for taking time and API and what they do.
Thank you, Chair.
All right, Kelly.
Okay, we are going to now take a 10-minute break. We will return at 3 p.m. We also want to say that the public viewing ability is going to do a technical syncing. So if you lose connectivity, please just rejoin on that technical website for webinar. This will not affect Zoom, only webinar. We will be back at 3 p.m.
All right, guys. Recap real quick a little bit. Basically, all the big companies are against proration, and all the small companies want it. I think Dean Foreman with API pretty well nailed the overall issue of proration. Is it hurts Texas more than it helps. If you notice, Diamondback, that dude is foaming at the mouth to buy out some competition in the Permian. There are risks of Eagleford getting taken out, possibly. So that is very much interesting. If you guys could, thank you so much for the ones that have liked. If you could like and subscribe. I'm doing a daily 5 p.m. podcast right now that in quarantine, it gives us all something to do. I could share my thoughts on stocks with you. If you have any questions for the 5 p.m., feel free to thank you, Muhammad, for the subscription. If you have any questions for the 5 p.m., a stock you want me to talk about during the 5 p.m., my email is on a lot of my videos. Feel free to email me. I can look them over, give my thoughts at the 5 p.m. Tomorrow, I'm going to actually go over Tesla a little bit as well. If you don't know, I've been long Tesla since about 2017. Long on their technology, battery things, stuff like that. That's why I'm long on them. Like the president, every once in a while, Twitter gets a little out of hand with Elon Musk, but definitely like the tech they have and the upside of the tech that Tesla has. So I'm going to kind of dive into that tomorrow at 5 p.m. And I'm going to be bouncing off a 2017 video because everybody to this day gives me shit on why I love Tesla so much. But in that 2017 video, I broke down some key things that I thought were going to happen. They have since happened that Tesla has done. And now tomorrow, I'm going to break down more things that I think are yet to come from Tesla that will make them even stronger. So make sure and subscribe. Check out the 5 p.m. If you got tankers, I'm talking about Scorpio tankers, and I really like the tanker play right now in this market. They're, I think, one of the few that are actually doing good in the market today. Scorpio tankers is up a couple percent. Everybody else is getting hammered. But all right, guys, this meeting should be starting shortly. About 5 minutes if you need to go pee or anything. So I want to hit the head too real quick. Thank you again for all the likes. Apache stock. Now, Apache, I have, if you look at my videos, I've had some pretty choice words for Apache. I did not like Alpine from the beginning. I called them out on Alpine High being mostly gas. And, you know, it took them 3 years and billions of dollars to accept it. And the concern I have right now is with their sure name discovery. How do we not know that's not more Alpine type trickery going on? Because Alpine, they released the big PR statement literally less than a month after a completion on an Alpine well that produced less than 100 barrels of oil. And see, to me, that is absolute deceit. Absolute deceit. Their wells that they're drilling now in the Permian are not sustainable. They have some legacy conventional. That's like the only thing going for them. And if in fact the offshore is good. But remember, Exxon, right next door to the Suriname offshore in Guyana, they need $35 to break even. That's lifting costs. Forget what they put into the exploration to get there. Just to get out of the ground costs them $35 a barrel. So Apache scares the hell out of me. Some people think they're a takeover target. I 100% respectfully disagree with them. But yeah, Apache, I wouldn't trust at all right now. There's too many ifs, ands, or buts, and not enough actual production. Look at their Altus pipeline as well. They had that spinoff of that pipeline company. A vast majority of that company is based on Alpine High, which is now defunct. So that company as well could be in trouble. This is important for that pipeline company because they actually have a epic pipeline deal that is moving crude oil from the Permian to Corpus Christi that should be coming online. This is very important for that as well and could spell trouble for that. So there's a lot going on with Apache, as you can tell. I just do not feel comfortable with. If you have to buy a stock right now, EOG, Pioneer, Exxon. But again, if you watched my video yesterday, Exxon literally has the same amount of cash as EOG, yet they have 5 times the amount of debt. EOG has 5 billion in debt and 2 billion in cash. 5 billion and 2 billion. Exxon has 25 billion in debt and 3 billion in cash. All right, guys, I want to step away real quick. Be right back. Good questions, though, James. All right. All right, guys, they're on break. They should be back any minute. see here. Oh, man.
You can't just think about oil when you're talking about prorating our oil production in this state. You necessarily cut gas and natural gas liquids when you cut oil. Right now, we can't tell you how much gas and liquids we will lose if you were to cut oil production by 1 million barrels a day. Nobody can tell you what that loss is, because the amount that's lost is going to depend on which wells get cut. Obviously, if you cut production from wells that, like Mr. Teague said this morning, pointed out, if you cut them from the wet gas streams we get from the casing heads. Crude oil wells in West Texas, then you're cutting a lot of gas and you're cutting an awful lot of liquids. What we can tell you, what we absolutely know, is that we have to have enough gas going into our pipelines every day to supply all the human needs customers, all the electrical generators in the state, and every business that's still open for business. They have to have all the gas they need. They have to have all the natural gas products they need. And we absolutely know that when the economy's open back, and everybody's trying to get back online, every industrial customer, every chemical plant, every manufacturer, every commercial customer, all the way down to every Whataburger has to have all the gas, all the natural gas liquids, and I would suggest to you all the oil.
He keeps cutting out. Ugh, dude. You had one job to do. Good internet.
Products they need, or you're going to hinder the economic recovery. I wish I could tell you there was some level of crude oil production you could cut and would be confident that we have enough of the other products in the rest of the industry to not worry about. I don't know what that level is. Nobody can tell us. But we do know that you have to get it right. You have to consider all the moving parts in this industry, not just crude oil. And you have to consider all the customers in this industry, not just refineries.
Thank you, Mr. Hand. That is the 3-minute timeline. Chairman?
Please continue your remarks.
No, here's something that here's what we really have to understand. If you start cutting oil production, you have to get it right for the rest of the industry. If you were to unintentionally cut liquids or gas below the level all the customers need, then we won't know that we have screwed up until after you've done it. You have to get it right. You have to think it through. You have to know what you're doing up front. Now, well, my 3 minutes is up. I'll be glad to answer any questions about these other issues if you have them. Otherwise, I'll sit down and shut up.
Okay. Members, any questions of Mr. Mann? Commissioner Craddock.
And thank you for addressing, I think, the whole chain, because that was been one of my concerns as well. As we affect oil here. What does it do to everything all the way down for other products? So I appreciate you addressing that. But one of the questions I've had since the beginning of time, and this has nothing to do with your age, but it does have to do with how long you've been in this industry. Do you remember any of these market demand hearings, or how we would work through this process, and what all of the you've addressed one piece, but all of the things we should be asking as we're going down this road? You have any, can you give us?
Yes, I do. Even though I'm an extraordinarily young man, the fact is, I worked at the Railroad Commission. I went to work at the Railroad Commission just a couple of years after market demand went to 100%.
Okay.
So I wasn't there when the commission was actually reducing or prorating below 100%. But the process was still in place, and the process was still going on, and the arithmetic was still being done every month. So I have some familiarity with how it worked and what they did, particularly since Judge Langdon was a commissioner at the time, and he had been a commissioner when, in fact, they were setting the oil allowable below 100% of deliverability. And the proration staff were still there. Just about everybody at the commission back then generally understood how it worked. They're all dead now. Everybody that knew how to do the arithmetic is gone.
Well, I've kind of found that. That's why I thought you might at least could remind us, or have some thought process, since we can't get in our own building at this point. Any knowledge of this.
But here's what they did, and it's not at all what was being talked about today. Okay. What the commission did and what the statutes require is that the commission found out from producers every month what they thought they could sell or use the following month. The producers determined how much they could, or estimated how much they would be able to produce and sell the following month. That established the size of the pie. The commission proration system then assigned every well in the state a slice of that pie and monitored it and regulated it. So if you ate more than your slice, you didn't get to eat for a while. Your well got shut in until you made it up. The whole purpose of proration back then was not to tell the producers how much they should produce, or to try to balance the market. It was to hear from the producers how much they thought they could produce, how much they could sell, and then divide that among every well in the state, so every well got at least a reasonable chance to produce what the commission decided was their slice of that pie. That's not what we're talking about here today. What we're talking about here today is something entirely different, and that is the Railroad Commission deciding how much producers should produce. Not the market, not the producers, but the Railroad Commission deciding how much they should sell or be able to sell. And then under the statute, you then have to roll that down to all the fields and all the wells. That requires a extensive data stream. You have to know production numbers. You have to know which fields can be cut back without damaging those reservoirs, as one of the prior speakers mentioned. You have to know which wells are statutorily exempt. You have to know which wells will be damaged if they get cut back. You have to look at the field rules for each field to see how the field rules in each field might set the allowable. If not, there's a statewide allowable rule that basically sets allowables based on depth. You have to know all those things to do it right. That data may still be at the commission somewhere. I am not aware that you currently have either the staff or the processes in place to put that data together and then slice every well a piece of the pie. it could be recreated, but it'd be based on a completely different process. And I would suggest to you, not the statutory scheme at all, for the commission to decide it is going to determine how much producers need to produce, instead of the producers coming in and telling you every month how much they think they can go and be able to sell the next month. The concept of waste that's been talked about here today, I do not believe is the statutory, the type of waste prohibited by the statute. Mr. Staples, I thought, explained that really well. Back in the 30s, when proration started,
That's that link I
produced
gave.
law without regard to how much they could sell, without regard to where they had a market for it. They were producing all they could produce to keep their neighbor from draining. Now they're putting it in wooden tanks. They're putting it in dirt tanks, pits in the ground. And there was just a wholesale free-for-all, who could drain who the fastest. That was the whole reason the legislature put in a proration system, was to keep the production down to what they could sell, what the market could handle, and make sure every producer got a chance to produce part of that. And that again is I don't think what's being suggested here today. What's being suggested here today is really not what the statute says, not what the commission has historically done. That's not to say you couldn't figure out how to do it, but it is to say that that's not the historic process is not what's being discussed here today. And I don't know what the courts will let you do or how that would turn out. But I'm pretty sure the litigation is going to outlast the prices.
Right. All right. Thank you, James, for the perspective and the understanding, because I think that's one of the questions that I started out the day with, and it seems to me we've been going down a different road than what we've done historically or what we've ever done. So I'm glad to know that somebody understands that and can give us some perspective. So I appreciate it. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, Mr. Mann, I want to thank you, sir, for taking time to be with us today, and also thank you for leading the Railroad Commission. You're part of the history and what has made the commission itself. What's been quoted, and I love the quote out of Forbes, it was the most respected regulatory agency for oil and gas on planet Earth. You're a part of building that, and thank you for, again, being a part today of educating we commissioners. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay.
Kelly?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Moving along. We now have Tom Daniel with the Texas Land and Mineral Owners Association.
Mr. Daniel, we appreciate you being here today. Would you please state your name for the record, your organization, and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the subject at hand?
I believe he just joined on. His mute is still on. Just need to unmute yourself, please. All right, Mr. Daniel, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Daniel, if you'll just give us your name, the organization you represent, and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the proration we're discussing today.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Commissioners, thank you for your opportunity to speak today. My name is Tom Daniel, and I'm here on behalf of the Texas Land and Mineral Association, representing approximately 1,000 mineral and royalty owners.
That's it?
Landowners, farmers, and ranchers.
Damn, I thought it'd be bigger.
Our members own over 3.5 million acres in all 254 counties. The association is neutral on proration. You've already touched on several issues that raise questions for us, such as whether a coordinated response is required, whether a free market is organically addressing the problem, storage capacity constraints, refiners, gatherers cutting purchases of oil, and other impacts of the lack of demand. The most important question for TLMA is how action or inaction with respect to proration will impact mineral owners in Texas. While our membership and some of our leadership
have differing opinions on the potential benefits and detriments of proration. TLMA is unanimous in supporting the requirement that any solution, whether proration or some other mechanism, must be fair and equitable to the mineral owners of Texas. For example, any guidelines should consider the effect on smaller operators who cannot afford to shut in their wells, the royalty owners who need such production income. You discussed possibly an exemption earlier today. Additionally, any decision should address rampant and excess natural gas flaring that is so prevalent throughout the state. Any decision should also consider that proration leading to more shut-in wells will most likely cause an increase in unplugged and abandoned wells, especially among smaller operators. TLMA wants to be sure the commission will continue to uphold plugging requirements and use available bond funds to ensure proper well plugging. We cannot make this bad abandoned well situation even worse by leaving behind a bunch of unplugged wells that will eventually ruin water tables. Also importantly, TLMA adamantly opposes that the Railroad Commission interfere in current lease or contracts that were negotiated in good faith with mineral owners. We respectfully do not believe the Commission has the authority to take such action, and it will not contribute to the solution. As our nation and the world addresses and recovers from this unprecedented pandemic, should the Railroad Commission determine that proration is necessary, TLMA respectfully urges the Commission to consider the interests of the mineral owners and royalty owners of the state in such decision and implement such proration fairly and equitably with respect to all mineral and royalty owners in Texas. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Are there any questions, members? No questions. Thank you for testifying. And indeed, we are concerned about the citizens of Texas that we were elected as commissioners to represent, which largely are represented by your organization. And we do thank you for taking time to testify. Kelly?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Moving on, we now have John Mabee. I believe he is representing himself.
Mr. Mabee, this is Wayne Christian. If you'd please identify yourself and who you represent, and if you're for, against, or neutral on the subject at hand.
Yes, and is my video feed off? I know it is.
It's off. I see your name.
Well, I even wore a tie today for it. Yes, this is John Mabee. I'm representing the Mabee Ranch Royalty Partnership. We have a medium-sized ranch in West Texas, north of Midland, and we are opposed to proration as has been suggested.
We appreciate that. And are there any questions, members? Maybe?
Okay.
Mr. Craddock.
I have, well,
statement. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, I do have a statement.
Silence, you know.
I have actually a lot of statement. I may not have an hour and a half like the first folks did, but I do have.
We'll give you 3 minutes.
You know, we oppose it primarily on 3 levels. On a practical level, just as we heard just previously from Mr. Mann, is that we're just not convinced that the Railroad Commission would be able to really enforce this. Not that I just think that the Railroad Commission seems to me to be pretty understaffed and underfurnished with some of the technology that it would need to really do a good job. We know that people will cheat at something when it's implemented, and so just look at Iran and OPEC. This will be a hard thing to manage. So on a practical level, we kind of object. We object because we also do not think that it's necessary. We think when you kind of like Occam's razor as far as how you look at things and solutions, the more complex a solution and the more moving parts there are to it, generally the more things to go wrong and the more unintended consequences. As we've heard previous testimony, the markets have already adjusted. In fact, the markets were adjusting before this happened. And so there is that. And then in principle, let's just go ahead and admit that we're in an economic war. And the idea that we could become a part of OPEC plus plus, as it's been, kind of coined, and then remove ourselves from that, I think is absurd. I think, and I do know something about human behavior, and I do know something about how groups operate. And the idea that we would be able to just simply walk away from this in the future is not likely in any shape, form, or fashion. And I do not think that we need to tie ourselves to foreign governments who are not our allies. So those were the main things. But as I listened today, I became really confused about what the market is and what the topic is. For instance, I hear that or read a slide that says if the market doesn't stabilize price, that proration and forced reduction will. But if the market reduction doesn't stabilize price, how is forced reduction going to do that? Which is what I consider the proration. And if market-driven reduction in drilling hurts service companies, how does forced reduction through proration not hurt them? And it just is, there's a bigger issue. This is not 1930s. This is not 1962. Yes, Texas is leading the way in terms of the United States production and oil and gas development across the country for sure. And we definitely have rattled our saber worldwide, but we are not a nation state. So for us to compete with Saudi and Russia, or to become Saudi and Russia in order to compete with them, I think is a dangerous slope. And as Dr. Foreman so eloquently put, is a slope full of unintended consequences that I think most of us can't imagine.
That is the 3-minute mark, Chairman Christian.
All right. Mr. Mabee, thank you. Mr. Craddock has some discussion with you.
Okay, thank you.
John, thank you for being here and giving us comments. I just wanted your perspective a little bit as a mineral owner, if how you thought proration could or potentially affect mineral owners generally, if we went down that road. And I appreciate your free market comments. I just wondered specifically the mineral owner, what you thought and how we needed to be aware of that.
Yes, ma'am. I'll probably be the contrarian on this issue. In my, from listening today as much as I could, and then just looking at things from a mineral owner standpoint, we have no cost in the development of these minerals. So for years, there's been economic destruction from the operators who were collecting minerals to put in their balance sheet and yet not delivering on the promise to extract them. And so from my point of view, if we have a proration that forces it, it allows, as Mr. Spark said, it allows operators that may be marginal to call uncle on force majeure and be able to retain leases that may be, 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, just been handed from one operator to another. And so instead of having to keep their poorly developed wells running by throwing a hot oil out there periodically, they can just keep them without producing. That's not an advantage to mineral owners in any shape, form, or fashion. Now, that being said, we are working very diligently and thoughtfully with our good operators, the ones who are actually responsible and doing a good job, Concho, Oventive, QEP being some of those, on trying to figure out how can we help them best by deferring some things and looking at various kinds of solutions that still keep the obligation to develop that I think is the intent of those contracts in the first place alive. But in my opinion, the worst thing that happens is you have a perpetual lease held by a shady operator sold to another operator who doesn't really produce much oil. and granted, I'm not an expert at all in any shape, form, or fashion with waste, but I have found it interesting that we're going from natural resources and preserving waste to preserving economic waste, and I think that very clearly is something that the oil market, the oil companies have done and have been punished by Wall Street for that way before this happened. And I don't think it's our job to protect that.
Thank you. I appreciate you being here today.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe thank you so much for staying around and testifying. We appreciate you so much.
Yes, sir. Have a good day.
Thank you. Callie?
Moving along, we now have Mr. Jim Burkhardt with IHS Market. You are now invited to speak.
Mr. Burkhardt, this is Wayne Christian. If you would please give us your name for the record, who you are representing, and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the subject at hand.
And Mr. Burkhardt, it looks like you're still on mute.
Am I off mute?
You are. Please begin.
Sorry about that. My name is Jim Burkhardt. I lead oil market research at IHS Market, which is a global information data and analytics company. We cover a range of industries. We have about 800 researchers, data scientists covering energy. We are neutral on this issue, but I do hope to provide some context that I hope is useful for your decision making. And also, I appreciate your stamina today. The chairman and the commissioner is quite impressive. So, the oil market has radically deteriorated since March. And that was one of the reasons that prompted the history to be made this weekend. And President Trump orchestrated the supply deal with Saudi Arabia and others. That was truly a milestone in oil market history, and that has very important implications, which I'll get to in just a moment. But I do have a slide, and if you could put it on slide 2, I want to get to the core of the matter. And the core problem that has led to this discussion today is a collapse in world oil demand. And we're, by our estimates, now explain kind of why we have our numbers here. You know, estimating demand in short order is tough in good circumstances. It's challenging today, but I think given the data we have, what we're seeing, the depth of the demand decline is unprecedented. Before today, before this year, the steepest decline we'd seen in a quarter over a 3-month period was during the financial crisis, when global demand, so we're looking at the global picture here, global demand fell about 3.5 million barrels per day. Then the first quarter of this year, China got hit hard. Global oil demand fell over 7 million barrels per day. And then in March, Europe and North America got hit, India as well. And we're looking at second quarter global oil demand that we estimate is going to be down about 22 million barrels per day from a year earlier. Whenever I say that, it's still it's obviously a very alarming number. Now, let me explain a little bit about how we got there, because we saw some other demand numbers. Let me explain ours. We have, first of all, these are global. So this is not just the U.S., although the U.S. is an important part of it. Some of the preliminary data we've been getting from Europe shows demand down 80% in March. We do a proprietary survey of 15,000 gasoline stations in the United States that account for about 20% of sales in the U.S. We do that each week. And for the week ending April 4th, gasoline sales by volume in our survey were down 48% from a year ago.
That is the 3-minute mark, Chairman.
See if you can wrap it up another minute, and then we'll have questions.
Okay, very good. So this is a global sharp decline in demand, and it's leading to a massive surplus. If you go to the next slide. So the supply surplus is going to be contained by shut-in production, by lower production around the world. We do think production in the second quarter is going to be almost 17 million barrels per day less globally than the first quarter because of low prices, the announced production cuts, and also the limits on storage that we see around the world. The U.S. is relatively well endowed with oil storage, but it's not the same elsewhere, apart from China. So second quarter, very difficult. The supply deal is not going to do a whole lot to alleviate the surplus in the second quarter, and I'll wrap up here with some implications of this deal that was completed over the weekend with President Trump heavily involved with Saudi Arabia and Russia. So what does that deal mean? One very important implication for the oil market is it ends the Saudi-Russian price. Now that didn't instigate this surplus, but it made it worse. So that has that truce, if you will, has alleviated a source of downward pressure on price for the moment. And it does increase the likelihood that in the second half of this year, we'll see continuing supply cuts around the world, some of them through a global deal. So that deal may not do much to alleviate the immediate surplus, but it could in the second half of the year. But just to conclude, the economy will recover. Oil demand will stop falling at some point, but it is going to be the pace of demand recovery that is going to dictate the price recovery in the months and years ahead.
Okay, thank you, sir. Are there any question members?
Yes, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Jim, the thing you sent in, you talked about storage, and you just mentioned storage again. Given where we are currently with prices, well, I guess first of all, when are y'all forecasting that storage that affects Texas? So if I'm talking about Cushing, Mont Belvieu, when do we run into storage? Let storage fill up.
Well, when storage doesn't have to fill up all the way to create difficulties, and I think over the next few weeks, certainly over the next 6 weeks, there are going to be increasing bottlenecks and difficulties related to storage. We've already seen that in some physical price discounts because the futures market is one price, but we've seen some physical prices be quite wide from the futures market in the last couple of weeks. And that's a signal of some of the stress that we're seeing on the logistics system in North America, including in Texas.
Am I right? You guys are forecasting out, based on the current scenario, include the OPEC cuts, supply, current supplies have come off. I think we're starting to see a little bit of demand growth in China. What are you guys seeing what are y'all forecasting right now in terms of prices, say 6 weeks out when we start to get into some storage challenges?
Well, again, the second quarter is going to be brutal, we believe, in terms of the market, because prices are one of the mechanisms that's going to lead to this really tough rebalancing with supply. Supply has to rebalance to a much lower level of demand. And prices could fall. We've had a price outlook of WTI falling as low as $10 a barrel.
Is that NYMEX? Is that NYMEX like a Cushing delivery, or is that a wellhead?
Cushing. It's a physical price in Cushing, Oklahoma.
Okay. And what would that mean when you take in all the discounts? What does that mean to a producer at the wellhead in the Permian Basin?
Well, it's new territory, and one thing that I found striking is we have about 300 oil companies that are clients of ours, and one question we've been getting more and more of over the last month is negative pricing. Could negative pricing materialize? So what does that mean? First of all, it means paying someone to take your oil. And I don't want to suggest we're predicting that will happen, but the fact that we're getting these questions from our clients it's a signal that this is a serious concern. It's a risk. depends on where you are. In Western Canada, we had prices that were about $3.50 not too long ago. So for some crudes, we haven't been that far away from zero pricing.
Just a few minutes ago, I guess we had the economist from the API was on, and he was pretty blunt in saying that the situation is not as doom and gloom as other people are going to forecast today. He gave some numbers that showed demand is not off of supply near as much as some of these other presentations. Can you speak to that? Is there?
Yes, I believe, I hope I characterized it correctly, but I believe those were U.S. numbers focused on the first quarter. So the numbers I presented were global, and remember, China was hit hard in the first quarter. Europe was hit hard in February and March. So globally, the first quarter was pretty bad. And now we have 97% of the U.S. population has been told to stay at home. So I think some of the U.S. data that was presented then didn't quite capture this very severe deterioration that's happened since the middle of March.
Okay. Have you guys modeled out, if we were to institute some sort of prorationing, what does that do to markets, to storage, to pricing? Have y'all taken a look at that and modeled out what that would look like?
Well,
can you opine on that? Yes,
yeah, what we've done is we've had to cut our production outlook, and there's three factors we've taken into account globally. One is storage, because there's some places in the world like West Africa, Russia as well, where they don't have a lot of storage. And if you can't sell it and you can't store it, you can't produce it, no matter how low your costs may be. So we look at storage around the world, and there's some places where it's really quite difficult right now, even more so than in the U.S. We looked at the announced production cuts. And one thing to keep in mind, one reason some of the production cuts have been announced is a reflection of reality. They can't sell it. So therefore, okay, we'll agree to cut because we can't sell it. But it's storage. It's due in part to the policy that's been enacted in some countries recently. And third is production costs. So there are some operators, Petrobras in Brazil is shutting in a couple 100,000 barrels per day. You've heard lots of folks today, unfortunately, talk about, shutting in production due to poor economics. So it's storage, it's policy, and it's low prices. Those are the three factors we took into account when we came up with our estimate of where production is going to fall in the second quarter around the world.
Jim, sorry, a little bit more specific. My question is, in the end, if all we can do is control Texas production, and you mentioned, I think, 22 million barrels a day that the market is oversupplied. That's your current, 22 million barrels a day of demand drop plus the supply excess. So 27 million barrels a day, I think was your, forgive me if I'm getting numbers crossed up here, but if we take 1 million barrels a day off the market, what does that do to a Texas producer, to pricing?
Well, again, I don't want to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but two comments. One is this is a global problem. It's bigger than Saudi Arabia. It's bigger than Russia. It's bigger than the United States. Yet, if supply is taken off the market, everything else equal, Econ 101 is that would support higher prices. And one reason this deal that came about over the past week, it arrested the price decline, at least for a time, because it gave the market this expectation that there'll be less supply on the market in the months ahead than would otherwise be the case. So, and another point is this deal is not static. I think we'll see more action in the months ahead. They've signaled they're going to continue with it. The exact numbers will change over time, but it's certainly not static. But you remove supply that supports prices higher than they otherwise would be.
I guess I'm trying to get some specifics from you on y'all's analysis in terms of prices at the wellhead, specifically in Texas, wellhead prices for producers, Cushing prices for producers relative to Texas production and storage. Are we in a situation where cutting Texas production, curtailing Texas production has any impact on storage, future outlook, and therefore prices going forward?
It does. I mean, Texas is a major global oil producer, and people are, around the world are, regularly looking at what's happening to Texas production to get an understanding of how severe it is. But one thing we've been telling our clients, and this, I wish I could say something else, but in the second quarter, there's really nowhere to hide. When we get beyond the second quarter, it is perhaps a different story. And that's why this agreement that was developed over the last week, it may not have much of an impact right now, this international agreement, but when you look at the third and fourth quarters of this year, it could prove to be more significant. I know that's not exactly answering your question, but I don't have a precise answer to your question.
Okay. Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Any more questions? Thank you very much, Jim, for being with us, and thank you for giving us the information.
Thank you.
Kelly?
Thank you, sir. Moving on along, Tom Sanzio with the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. You are invited to speak.
Tom, if you'd introduce yourself and say what organization you are representing and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the pro-rationing.
My name is Tom Sanzillo. I'm the Director of Finance at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis and for proration. First, I wanted to thank you for inviting me. I'm a former public official from New York State, and I was honored to be asked to attend what was, I understood to be a public hearing on oil production goals, and I now see that this is about the soul of Texas. So I am particularly honored and humbled. I understand that the commission as an institution is not perfectly suited for this role, but it's the best forum you have, and we have, and as such, the commission has a responsibility to take bold action now, as it has throughout its history. The problems of oversupplied markets and low prices, aligning interests within the industry, technology competition, and the changing composition of economic growth predate the coronavirus outbreak and will persist long after the pandemic passes. The demand freeze brought on by the coronavirus brings into sharp relief the need for a new business model. Any short-term fix designed by the commission or government support for additional storage capacity will return markets not to the previous status quo, but to a reduced level of chaos in the oil and gas markets and the finance sector. The business model for the industry is financially broken. The entire industry has been a last-in-class performer for most of the past decade. From 1970 to 2000, the industry led the market, first in class, worldwide, always. There was a time when the industry claimed 28%, the Standard & Poor's 500. Today, it is only 2.6%. The massive production boom alluded by the various commentators here is impressive, but the surpluses have also precipitated an era of value destruction in the financial markets and heightened the importance of realigning government and industry interests. The coronavirus has put this dynamic on steroids. The positions articulated by those who oppose RRC action themselves provide reasons why the RRC should act. These opponents offer no solutions. Some argue that the issue should be settled by a kind of free market free-for-all, pitting independent producers against integrated oil interests. Such a proposal is precisely why you need a regulator. The structure of demand for oil and gas is undergoing a massive transformation. Today, renewable energy, electric vehicles, plastics recycling, home energy demand-side initiatives, new efficiency models, and laws restricting fossil fuel use compete with industry growth scenarios. Even as energy demand grows, the markets that serve that demand are expanding beyond the oil and gas industry. Finally, we have a system in which global prices are not set by a free market, but by a consortium of foreign countries. A new player at the global table is needed and likely to be unwelcome. What is needed is a trusted leader, and the Texas Railroad Commission is it. One purpose of a public regulatory body is to step in when markets are in a state of imbalance, of severe and persistent imbalance, and there are no clear solutions. That is the case today. The Commission has the opportunity to address short-term problems and a mandate to be an ongoing venue for understanding the kind of market dynamics that we've been just discussing here, new global realities, new financial competitors, changing alignments within the industry, and environmental and climate change challenges. I thank
That is the
you for your
3-minute
time
limit.
and for inviting me to speak.
Thank you very much.
Perfect timing.
That was perfect. Are there any question, members? I can't see you, so unless you speak up. Mr. Sanzello, thank you so much for visiting with us today. We appreciate so much your information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Kelly?
Moving right along, we have Bob McNally with Rapidan Energy Group.
Mr. McNally, if you'd please give us your name, who you represent, and whether you're for, against, or neutral on the proration.
My name is Bob McNally. I represent Rapidan Energy Group, an energy market consulting firm, and I am very neutral on the position of prorationing in Texas. Mr. Chairman, I'm honored to come to you today mainly from the perspective of an oil historian, a historian of the Texas Railroad Commission and supply control, and like my friend Jim earlier, also an analyst in the oil market and so forth. I do have a slide presentation. We'll move to the next slide, please. We'll talk a little bit about history first. Mr. Chairman, you and I met. Todd Staples had us for barbecue at Texoga, and after my book came out, Crude Volatility, because I look back at how the oil industry has sort of managed the problem of boom-bust oil price cycles. And this chart here shows you, has prices going all the way back to 1859. And what it shows, and what my book was about, was we had tried the free market in oil, and we hated it. And by we, I mean just about everybody in the planet, from the oil industry to governments to consumers to producers. We don't like it because when there's no supply control, the price of oil ranges between shut-in and demand destruction. Too volatile. And it's given that oil is and remains and will remain the lifeblood of modern civilization, it's been really difficult for society to handle that. So we've had 3 groups of supply controllers come in. We've tried it private sector, we've tried it public sector, we've tried it hybrid. The first controller there was Mr. Rockefeller. He came in the late 1800s, and he did it from a perspective of monopolizing refining and integrating with midstream. Did a pretty good job. And then we broke up Mr. Rockefeller, and we had our last sustained boom-bust period from 1911 to 1932, and really did hate that. And now oil is becoming a transportation fuel mainly, so it was a vital commodity before it had been illumination. So that experience with boom-bust prices so terrified Texas and Oklahoma, they got in the business of proration. And just to comment a little bit, and I respect Mr. Mann's experience and so forth, but my read of history is the Texas Railroad Commission, your predecessors met every month for 40 years, and they calculated a call on Texas oil, and they handed, as the gentleman said, a quota well by well, field by field. They told them how much exactly they could produce for 40 years. And they did that by doing what OPEC tries to do now, calculating an estimate of demand for Texas oil. On the resourcing issue, when the OPEC got started in 1960, they actually took staffers from the Railroad Commission to help them figure out how to do the work. So OPEC takes over about 48 years ago today. It was just 48 years ago last month that your predecessor, and what is called a damned historic occasion, for the first time went to 100% market demand, so no longer required production to be held back. And OPEC took over for 40 years. In my view, OPEC has been AWOL since 2008. They've been irrelevant. The only game in town in terms of a swing producer has been OPEC plus, and that gets to this where we are today. Let me just go to the next slide real quick. This is the last historical point. We're going to get on to the here and now. I do want to point this out to you. People say it's unprecedented. It's unprecedented. It certainly is. We just haven't seen in modern times such a fast and massive decline in demand for oil recently. But I want to take you back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, that chart shows you that the Texas Railroad Commission and other oil states held back over 20% of global oil production through quotas in their own states. Now we talk about 3 or 5% being a lot of spare capacity. 20% in Texas. You were forcing producers, as the gentleman said, to only produce 8 or 7 days a month. And you did that because there was so much oil available in the Middle East and our imports were flooding in. The Seven Sisters, they operated a cartel that sort of piggybacked on the Texas Railroad Commission. I point out the 1950s just to show how important supply control was to Texas. Now, I'm going to go to the next slide. When we get to today, we're not like back then. Several folks have said it, and it's absolutely true. Texas is in no position to be the central banker of oil anymore. Absolutely not. So I don't think anyone's saying, well, we did it before, we should do it again. I think that's not the issue. The issue is how to deal with this emergency and this demand collapse. And Jim has talked about it. Jim Burkhardt from IHS and others have said, I think I don't have to go through the numbers. I'm happy to, in the Q&A, talk about our numbers. I'll show you those in a second. But as a result,
this is actually the 3-minute mark, Commissioner Christian.
Please complete your presentation and we'll take questions.
All righty. Well, the slide 4 just shows you, and as a result of the deal, I think we sort of put a peak in inventories and they started to decline later this year. But like everybody else has spoken today, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. The next and last slide will just present to you our oil balance. And in case any questions come in on that, I would direct your attention to the implied surplus line on that balance. If it gets too complicated, that's sort of the net of everything. You can see there in the second quarter of 2020, we have a 13 million barrel a day surplus despite the OPEC plus cut that was put into place. So like my friend Jim Burkhardt, our barrel counting suggests it's going to get a lot worse, price going a lot lower before they go higher. This deal over the weekend will help us accelerate out of the glut faster. I wish I had better news. I appreciate and I'm honored to be invited to participate in today's hearing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate it a lot your being here. Members, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Sure. Bob, stay here for a second. I actually have a couple questions for you. First of all, in the presentation that you sent in, you said an epic crude tsunami that will swamp storage and hammer oil prices is unavoidable. You go on to talk about some other things. Can you? I'll keep reading from yours because one thing I'm trying to wrap, I guess, our heads around or come to a conclusion on is what do we think the level of waste is? It's one thing for you to say there is or there is not waste, and we can talk about it in terms of barrels. Your number here is, I guess, 13 million barrels a day as we go into the second quarter of global oversupply. Can you speak to, as that specific point, if we get into this storage issue, what happens to pricing in Texas then?
Sure. And again, as an economist and oil analyst, I don't deal with the concept of waste. That's a legal issue, and I'm not a lawyer. We do deal with oversupply and surplus, though. And here's the bottom line. It's a 100 million barrel a day market. We're going to lose 20 to 30 million barrels a day. We heard some stats earlier on the demand decline in the second quarter. We hope it'll come back in the second half of the year, but we don't know. But right now, this quarter, we're dealing with a 20 to 30 million barrel a day product demand decline. That means crude oil is going to go down probably about 20 million barrels a day, 25. This OPEC plus deal, we estimate, took about 9 million barrels a day of real cuts off the market, maybe a little more, but that's about it. So in terms of a problem, if you will, by that I mean problem meaning oil with nowhere to go, but into increasingly scarce storage, you're talking about 10 to 15 million barrels a day or so in the second quarter. Now that will start to fill up available storage, usually at the end of the line and the supply system and inland. So Cushing, we would agree generally with the comments earlier, Plains, All-American and others, that sometime May, June, Cushing is likely to get close to full. Before that point, oil prices will collapse much lower to really almost punish any producer that brings a barrel out of the ground because there simply won't be anywhere to put it or burn it above earth.
So, Bob, what you're saying punish. So are we expecting prices at that point to go, are you saying they're going to go to zero at the wellhead?
I wouldn't be surprised if they went to zero or negative at the wellhead for many producers. In Canada, we're only a few dollars from zero right now. I think if you think about the front month futures price, I think that can go easily into the teens for WTI and Brent, which would imply that physical prices as well. We could easily see single digits, teens, I think, and for some wellhead prices. Certainly in North America, yes, I think we could see zero or negative before we get out of this.
Okay. The table you've got up here right now, and we haven't talked about this any today, but it is a. Oh, can you leave that table up? Actually, I'll just try to pull from it. You showed in the fourth quarter of 2020 an undersupply of 5.1 million barrels per day. Is that right?
That's right.
Talk to us about what happens to oil prices in the fourth quarter this year if that happens.
Sure. And so those are quarterly balances, right? So and that forecast bakes in this OPEC plus cuts. It also assumes that we're going to have some demand recovery here, that this virus is not going to come and whack us in the fall even worse, and that we're going to gradually reopen the economy. One could argue that's optimistic. So I'm being very clear. This is based on a fairly optimistic recovery in demand and adherence to these cuts. So you get deficits in the third quarter, 2.8, fourth quarter, 5.1. That means we're going to start to crawl out. I had that earlier chart showing that inventory from all-time high levels, if not tank tops in some regions, will start to crawl out. And as we crawl out, we think oil prices will begin to rise. We have Brent, we'll talk WTI, but we have TI averaging $18 in the third quarter. That's front month spot WTI, and then getting to $28 in the fourth quarter. And that's assuming, again, world's growing, we're recovering, the market sees the inventory starting to clean up, and so we think we'll come out of the teens and get into the 20s and 30s by the end of the year.
All right, Bob, my last question is if we were to implement proration, we've been talking about 20% some today, how does that affect this model? What do you see in terms of prices, storage, that sort of thing, if we do something?
Sure. Well, we and others would have to look at if you did something in the following way. There's kind of two ways. One is, would you be taking more Texas oil off the market that is not already coming off the market? That's point number one. And so we'd have to see what kind of a system are you designing, what were we baking in already, or is what you're going to do what you might do just shift who cuts, but not by how much. So that's point number one. Point number two is, to what degree would your action and the action by potentially other oil states influence Saudi Arabia, Russia? They're going to be meeting on June 10th. I do recommend putting that in your calendars. That'll be the next OPEC Plus meeting, and they will be looking at this deal and looking at the numbers. And if they've turned out as badly as I and others think, they're probably going to be looking at other cuts. So then the other issue will be, to what degree are they going to insist on other hard contributions in terms of cuts from other G20 countries, including possibly Texas. So those two things would go into how we would adjust our supply going forward versus a base case.
Okay, I think what I heard there, Bob, was in short, if all you guys do is go cut right now on your own, doesn't do anything. If it's part of a big international deal, then that could make a difference.
Well, just to be clear, it does depend on what the base case was for Texas. We don't have a forecast of Texas production per se, but we'd have to figure one out. If you went ahead and put in place prorationing, we'd have to assess what impact that's likely to have, and would it affect the outcome versus a case where there was no prorationing, and that would depend on the details. So it might affect how much Texas production we see. That's point number one, but it'd probably be fairly small, in the hundreds of thousands of barrels a day, I would think, if anything. Secondly, it would be, was your decision instrumental in all in getting OPEC Plus to do more? And that would be just up in the air. That's a wild card.
Okay, I think that's all my questions. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Bob, I did enjoy visiting with you a couple of years back during session, I believe it was, in Austin. The question I have is, looking at your report indicates central management is about your answer to things. And just, it's because you feel I take it in your conversation with Commissioner Sitton that you just feel like at this point the total amount Texas could influence the international production just makes ours almost a somewhat close to an insignificant case.
Well, let me, Chairman Christian, it's great to see you again. As you know, I work for President George W. Bush as his energy advisor. That tells you where I'm coming from. I'm a free market, small government guy. But my read of history suggests that we, and I mean Texans, Americans, the world, can't stand, literally don't have stomach for free market oil prices. It's just too volatile. So the question becomes, what kind of policy is needed to stabilize the industry? And we found that somebody controlling the wellhead production is the best way to do it. And that happens to be now, it had been OPEC and now OPEC Plus in Saudi Arabia. So, you know, in the best world of worlds, I think you would see OPEC Plus successfully manage this problem. But the problem is probably too big, this demand collapse, to avoid this near-term pain. So, no, I don't think central management for Texas is the right thing. I don't think Texas is absolutely instrumental for this. But we're in one of these points where, and you saw this in other boom bust eras. When you had a price collapse, producers would form ad hoc groups and say, look, we're all in this together. If you don't contribute, no one contributes. The first one was called the Oil Creek Association of 1861. They get together, and I think that's what's happening now. The question is can Texas stand aside while OPEC Plus and others go ahead and make discretionary cuts? Maybe you can, but maybe you can't. That's kind of the question. That's what makes this particularly vexing, is to what degree even symbolic or small volumetric contributions by Texas are needed to catalyze broader efforts. I think that's at the heart of the conundrum here.
I appreciate it. I was looking for a surefire answer how to fix this whole thing. But if ifs and buts was candies and nuts, I think is what we're saying here.
What the hell?
Thank you so much for allowing us this and visiting with us and providing us testimony. I
You
appreciate
say
it.
nuts and butts?
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, Callie?
All right. Thank you, sir. Moving along with James Labas with Tax and Fiscal Consulting.
Mr. Labas, if you would, please give us your name, who you represent, and if you're for, against, or neutral on the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. My name is James Labaugh, and I'm speaking today on my own behalf against proration. Texoga, a client, asked me my opinion on the matter, and it's shown in the document entitled Pro-Rationing Will Reduce Texas State Revenue. It's from that document I'll be referring. Hopefully you have it handy. Are y'all getting my video?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm speaking to you today as a former chief revenue estimator of the state, a position I held for 6 years under Controller Rylander, who, as you know, had also been railroad commissioner. In the words of Bob Bullock, who was controller when I first went to work for him, there are just two parts to a tax system, the rate and the base. And to follow on from Billy Hamilton, the deputy controller and now deputy chancellor, when you cut the tax base, the first thing that happens is you get less money. So if we may please turn to page 1 of the document, I have a big disclaimer. I'm a proud alumnus of the Controller's Office, but my conclusions are not necessarily those of the Texas Controller. Mr. Hager is fully capable of rendering his own views on the matter. But as I see the situation, a reduction in Texas oil production that forced production down by 10%, below where the free market would otherwise produce, would cost the state at least $236 million a year in lost revenue. And at 20%, the loss would be $472 million a year. These are conservative estimates. I've counted only the loss of oil severance tax and state royalties. In reality, there would be losses in sales taxes, franchise tax, etc. Real losses would be higher. Let's look at page 2. I don't need to tell you that the taxes paid by industry, the oil and gas industry, are high and volatile. That's the nature of the business and of the Texas tax structure. The green line graph that you see near the top of the page shows how production has responded to price. The price declines we endured 5 years ago, falling in half like now, resulted in a 14% decline in production. For today's purposes, I'm assuming the same result, 14%. And in the table below the line graph, you'll see the combined result of the price decline itself, plus the 14% decline in production as a result, still leaves the state with about $2.4 billion in revenue. It's still a lot of money. And that's what the free market should deliver to the state under these conditions, $2.4 billion a year. But if you take away 10% of that, by pro-rationing or any forced reduction, you take away $236 million a year. And take away 20%, it's $472 million. In a world where Texas just produces 5% of the oil, we can't bully the market. A 10 or 20% reduction would be the tiniest share of global production, which could be immediately replaced by non-Texas production, leaving us only with the lost production, lost jobs, lost royalties, and lost revenues. Thank you.
Any question, members?
I have one question.
Sitting.
It seems like in your analysis that you're assuming that if something was prorated, in other words, when you say $236 million or whatever, that's assuming that the price of oil does not change. Is that correct?
Well, that's assuming a $27 price for oil. Now it changes every time I look at it, but that number would change as the oil price rises and falls. Yes.
So my question is, if something was done on prorationing, which pushed the price of oil up, then that number in terms of the amount that was lost is no longer the right number, right?
Well, I would argue that it is, because we can't change the price of oil with 1%. It's just too small. If we had 50% of the market, then maybe we could push the market around.
My question, I'm not asking you to opine on whether or not it changes the market. We've asked the Rapid End guys that sort of thing. Some of those. But my point is, I'm just asking about your numbers here. You assume that a prorationing cut would have zero impact on prices. That's an assumption built into your analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. That's my only question, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question. Okay. So, James, I don't know if you were on earlier when Diamondback was testifying, and they said if we did pro-rationing, they would cut production. They would just quit drilling, basically. Do you have any thoughts about how that might affect? Do you agree with that analysis potentially? And have you figured out how you would factor that in if that's the direction we went? Or do you think proration actually does that for us?
I don't. I'm going to let each of the companies speak for themselves. If that would be their reaction, then that might be an objective reaction for that company's part. The way that I look at it is sort of like, if we've got, if there's an industry that's been hurt worse than oil, it's hospitality, right? Restaurants, bars, hotels. They're down 80%. It cannot be the answer to say, what you need to do is go close some more of your hotel rooms in the restaurant bars. Each company will have to react in their own way, whether it's pro-rationing or market forces.
Okay. And can I ask you, I know you said you didn't take into account, but do you have an estimate of what it would do to what just being down, say, today would be to sales and property taxes versus if we pro-ration? Do you have any idea? I mean, do you expect that to go down? You just don't know at this point.
I'm sorry, you're asking if I use, say, $20 instead of $27?
Yes.
I can recalculate that. Be happy to do that.
Okay.
But just keep in mind, even at $20, every barrel of oil generates $1 in tax revenue for us, right? That's $1 million a day we're talking about, 365 days a year. Just the tax would be $365 million, which is like closing the University of Texas at Austin or Texas A&M University. You got to pick one. There are fiscal consequences to what we're talking about today, and I wanted to bring that to y'all's attention because this is real.
Okay. I know we've been also talking about sales taxes and property taxes specifically. And if so, is there any way to quantify the drop in oil and how it's going to affect property taxes? I know that's one of the conversations that's going on across the board right now. Do you have any idea? Is it
industry pays the big chunk? The size will be roughly the same. It is property and sales taxes are about the size of the sum of severance tax and royalties. But severance tax and royalties respond immediately to production. Property and sales do not. Sales tax actually precedes production, of course. Almost everything that goes down whole is plus sales tax, and it's in the billions of dollars too, by the way, just from oil and gas, a couple of $1 billion every year. Property tax lags, so it doesn't move in lockstep, or at least in the same timing, in real time, the way that severance and royalties do.
Okay.
This presentation could be double if you roll in property tax and sales tax, but you never really know when those are going to hit.
Okay.
Did that help? Did I answer your question?
It did, yes. Yeah, I'm just trying to get a bigger picture. I mean, we can look at one little part, but this industry affects every piece in the entire state. And so if we go down a road, how much is it going to affect in the price of oil? And if we proration and it pops up or doesn't pop up, or we continue to lose jobs. I mean, I think you've testified well that oil and gas affect everything in this state, every tax, right? So
yes, ma'am. And all we've been talking about today, you and I, are the direct taxes paid.
Yes, sir.
Once you start talking about the indirect, it's bigger still.
Right. No, I'm just talking about direct. So
yes,
the
ma'am.
Indirect just gets real big. So even more so, and we'll lose. I mean, we're losing jobs, and people are losing their jobs today, which is going to affect a lot of things as well. So I appreciate the answers to my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's a things you're looking at.
Sad situation.
Yeah, it is a sad situation. I'm wondering, I know you're presenting us with oil and gas and more directly those costs. Have you made an estimate, being former comptroller, of what we're looking at potentially the next session overall, the shortage compared to the last?
No, sir.
Okay.
I would probably be shot by Glenn Hager.
Just wondering. You work for Carroll, so I mean, I thought
you never stop working for controllers.
That's right. That's right. Very much. Well, thank you so much for this information. It's very good, and we appreciate you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Kelly?
Moving along. Thank you, sir. We now have Will Vanlow with Quantum Energy Partners.
Mr. Vanlow, if you would please introduce yourself and who you represent, and for the record, for, against, or neutral on the subject.
Great. Good afternoon, Chairman Christian and Commissioner Craddock and Commissioner Sitton. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing. My name is Will Vanlow, and I'm the founder and CEO of Quantum Energy Partners. I used to be against pro-rationing, but after careful study of the history of pro-rationing in our state, the situation of all independents in Texas, not just the big guys like us, and assessing the current global marketplace, I've changed my position and am now for what I call conditional pro-rationing, which I'll explain over the next few minutes. Quantum is one of the largest global energy private equity funds, and through our various portfolio companies, we have for the last 5 years been in the top 5 most active drillers in the state. Additionally, we are a large midstream and oilfield service provider in the state as well. You've heard testimony today from a lot of different people against pro-rationing. While their arguments are all quite interesting, most are irrelevant, and candidly, many of the arguments are very self-serving. If I was simply promoting what is best for my company in the short run, and we are an extremely well-capitalized, large oil and gas producer and midstream player, I would also be coming down on the side of no to pro-rationing. But I'm more concerned about the long-term health of our industry and our state, the economic well-being currently of my fellow Texans as well as the state, and the geopolitical security of our country. Opponents of pro-rationing generally cite that free markets work and that we should just let them play out. But the truth is, there is no such thing as a free market in the world right now, and there hasn't been for some time, as evidenced by the mass intervention by Western world governments to stabilize markets during the 08-09 Great Financial Crisis, and most recently during the past month to again stabilize markets during the coronavirus pandemic. The reason governments intervened is simple. The free market would destroy itself if it went unchecked, as many companies would go bankrupt, and the largest, most liquid and well-capitalized entities would swallow up much of their competition. So the system of capitalism the world now works under is one where the markets are generally left alone, except during extraordinary times of volatility. And that, commissioners, is exactly what we are experiencing right now in the oil and gas industry, and why you must intervene.
JP Morgan.
As I've listened to this call for the last 5.5 hours, I sense a tone deafness to what is really happening in the world of energy right now. We're talking about a supply-demand imbalance of at least 20, maybe as much as 30 million barrels a day. And to put this in context, and has previously been explained, WTI prices dipped into the single digits in 98 and 99, and again in 08-09 and 2015, 2016, when supply outstripped demand by only 2 to 3.5 million barrels a day. So today we're talking about a supply-demand imbalance that is 10 to 15 times greater than anything we've seen before, even materially greater than the imbalances that occurred in 1986. As much as I hate to say it, the 9.7 million barrel a day cut by OPEC Plus really doesn't matter. It's the proverbial putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, as evidenced by oil prices being down 10% since the OPEC announcement 3 days ago. We're pretending if we think this initial cut by OPEC Plus will help prices. We need another at least 10, maybe as much as 20 million barrels a day of production cuts to stabilize global oil markets. And to get that, the state of Texas, along with every other oil producing state in the U.S., is going to have to take an active role in alleviating the largest oil market imbalance the world has ever seen. I am not suggesting Texas unilaterally enact production cuts via pro-rationing. I'm advocating for Texas as the largest oil producer in the U.S., which is now the largest oil producer in the world, to exercise its rightful leadership and work with other states in the U.S. and other countries around the world to craft a global supply curtailment plan that works to truly stabilize global oil markets. Pro-rationing is a primary tool you've been given to do that in our state, but I believe you have a lot of optionality in how you can choose to implement it.
We are at our 3-minute mark. Chairman Christian?
Please continue, Mr. Penrose.
Thank you. No industry can survive long-term when the price they receive for their product fluctuates 50 to 60% on a quarterly basis. Do you think Apple would be what it is today if last quarter they sold their iPhone for $1,000 and this quarter they can only sell it for $400? Absolutely not. And by the way, they are able to maintain their pricing power because they operate in what is known as an oligopoly, hardly a free market. So in summary, if we let this fictitious free market run its course, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. Most of the big companies will survive, but many of the small and medium-sized independents will go under, not just in Texas, but throughout our country. Number two, we will see record bankruptcies and record job losses in our state. Production in our state will fall as there will be significantly fewer producers drilling wells going forward, which means royalty income and severance and ad valorem tax income in our state will drop meaningfully into the future. Innovation will slow materially. History has shown it's been the entrepreneurial small and mid-sized companies that made the miracle of the shale revolution possible. Let's not forget that the Permian Basin heavyweights like Concho, Diamondback, and Parsley all started out as small entrepreneurial private companies. And finally, the U.S. will never again regain its supremacy as the largest oil producer in the world.
That is bullshit.
And in fact, we will again become a large net oil importer.
So
I implore you not to simply stand by and watch the make-believe free markets destroy our domestic energy industry, because that's truly what's at stake here. These are extraordinary times, and the extraordinary times require extraordinary leadership. Your leadership. I hate to tell you this, but the three of you picked one heck of a time to serve as Texas Railroad Commissioners. So thank you for your time today, and happy to answer questions.
Thank you, sir. Any questions, members? Commissioner Craddock.
Well, I've got a quick question. So in your statement, in your written statement, you said temporary. How long do you foresee when you say temporary prorationing generally? What are the benchmark to get us past temporary? I mean, is it long term? I appreciate you. We need to have you're saying now craft a global oil supply market. I'm talking about temporary in your statement. Do you have what the benchmark is to back off on that if we decide to go down this?
Good question. And for the record, I am a free market person through and through. Unfortunately, as I said, we don't live in a world of free markets. I wish we did. And so because of the U.S. is now being the largest producer globally, because Texas being the largest producer in the U.S., we have to show leadership. And so what I mean by temporarily is as long as it takes to get world supply and demand into a balance so that we can have prices that are stable enough to enable the U.S. oil and gas industry to get back to work. Because at current prices, if you're not hedged, there's very few wells that are going to get drilled in the United States. And everybody that's been on the phone today knows that. So it's really going to be dependent upon how long the demand destruction from coronavirus lasts. It could be quarters, it could be years. But as soon as we get some sort of stability back, then I'm definitely for backing off that. But right now, without some sort of price stability mechanism, this price will drive most producers in this country out of business. Coronavirus is significant. The demand destruction is significant. It's not going to come back next month or even probably next quarter. So I think we have to be willing to think about this. You have a little bit of a calm, in my opinion, before the storm really hits. Right now, we have a thunderstorm, not a hurricane. You've got time to kind of, board up the windows. Texas needs to think hard over the next 30 days about how it can be the leader in the United States to get a plan in place, because prices are going to go. It's going to get worse, not better, with the production cuts, the small production cuts that have been made.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, sir. Willie, you talked about right there at the end, until prices are stable. Do you have an idea what point is at what price are things stable? Can you give me a sense of what that is?
I think anything below $50, to be very blunt, a good portion of North American oil drilling does not work. And when you look at prices that Middle East and Russia and others need, it's at least $50, if not higher. So, in my mind, the industry in the U.S. does not work very well when prices are below 50.
You also, thank you. You referenced service companies a little bit. You're kind of flying through. I was making a lot of notes when you're talking about if these continue, the number of bankruptcies and the majors. I appreciated your candor and the picture of what you think is going to happen. Can you talk a little more about service companies? You mentioned that, but what's the impact to the service industry? We heard earlier a little bit about that, but I know you also said you invest in service companies as well as drilling companies. Okay, can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, I think the service companies, they've been hit worse because they've been beat up for longer than the E&P companies have. So you've got a lot of smaller and mid-sized service companies in the state that are barely hanging on. And what every E&P company's doing right now is going back to them and asking them, can you lower your cost another 10 or 20%? And you can't blame the E&P companies for doing that. They have to get the cost structure down to drill. But the flip side is the service companies have already been cut to the bone. Many of them are not profitable today. And so you've got thousands and thousands of people employed in the service industry in the state, and they're gonna get laid off if we can't get rigs back running again. And we can't get rigs back running again. I mean, if you look at the last 2 weeks alone, we've cut 60 to 75 rigs each of the last 2 weeks, and it's plummeting. That's a national figure. But these service companies, there's going to just be no work for them to do if we can't get prices stabilized and rigs back to work.
You talk about $50 a barrel, and let's even use 40. I mean, whatever, something a lot higher than we are now. One of the challenges, in fact, I'd say, well, the challenge, but how do we, if we're at, I think you said a 10 to 20 million barrel a day, at least 10 million barrels a day of additional cuts are needed. How do we can't cut that much. How do we get that done in a way to make that a reality as opposed to just cutting 1 million barrels here in Texas?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because obviously Saudi and Russia are expecting production cuts from the U.S., from Mexico, from Norway, from Canada. And none of those, I guess, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, and Norway, I guess, technically don't have a mechanism to do that officially at the federal government level. Certainly we don't in the U.S. And so, it's going to be tough. It'll be interesting to see how much adherence to the cuts you're going to see out of OPEC and Russia. If production does not materially decrease in the non-OPEC plus countries. And so, and that's before it's apparent that the first round of cuts were not near enough. So I think we're in a new world order today, Ryan. I think we're in a new world order where the United States went from being the largest importer of oil in the world to now the largest producer of oil in the world. This is much more akin to what the U.S. was back in the days where the Railroad Commission did do pro-rationing. And so pro-rationing may not be the perfect solution. It's not. There's a lot of problems with it. I acknowledge those. I am not for across-the-board X% cuts. I think that several of the public company speakers have I think, articulated very good arguments how that incentivizes irrational behavior. But you all are the leaders in the state that is the biggest producer in the U.S. You're going to have to figure out how to get production cuts in the U.S. because without them, this industry is going to get destroyed.
All right, Will, I've got one other question. We've heard a lot today about regulatory certainty, regulatory uncertainty, questions about, hey, if we do this, we're going to not invest in Texas, or it's going to add additional risk to Texas. So from your investor perspective, I think that's something we need to be cautious about, is introducing something that makes Texas less attractive to invest in. So can you opine on that?
I actually think that's one of the craziest things I've heard on this hearing all day. I'm an investor. I run one of the largest energy funds in the world. And the problem that investors have with energy is that it has returned abysmal returns for the last decade. The shales have been the biggest destroyer of capital in modern history in any industry. And that's what investors don't like. And one of the reasons that shale has destroyed so much capital has been because of the mass, ups and downs of prices. It's very hard to allocate capital in a world where your revenue line can move 50 or 60% after you've allocated the capital. That's what investors hate about the industry. And regulation, energy is one of the most regulated industries in the world, period. Investors have always been very comfortable investing in regulated. So utilities are maybe the most regulated industry, at least in the energy space they are. Look how well they perform. Look how much capital has flown to utility companies. And so that I don't buy that one bit. I actually think the best thing we can do to get investors back into the space, other than actually do what we tell them we're going to do, is to generate consistent return on the capital we invest as an industry. And there is no industry in the world that has the kind of volatility in the prices that the company gets paid as the oil and gas industry. So that's what doesn't work. That's why investors don't like the space.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Will, can you help me a little bit? Is one of the reasons that we're having problems, and you're having problems, and what I'm trying to understand is the large upfront cost to the shale and horizontal drilling entire methodology that is inherently a lot of dollars up front, off back, and these inconsistent returns. You're saying the market fears energy?
Yes, sir. So if you look at what has happened over the last decade in the oil shales, you've had hundreds of billions of dollars get spent on land to start with. And then you had lots of money spent on drilling wells, completing wells, tying those wells in. And it was made based on assumptions about what future commodity prices were going to be. And unfortunately, there was no scenario that anybody ran of $25 oil. Most likely, they didn't even run $35 oil scenarios. Okay. And here's the issue. In order for the shale industry to get to 13 million barrels a day of production in the U.S., it took a capital investment well north of $1 trillion. And the vast majority of investors that invested that $1 trillion are no longer investing in the space. And the reason they're not is because year after year after year, return on capital employed at these public companies that they invest in, and a lot of the private companies as well, has been low to mid-single digits. And that's just not acceptable, because they can go to any other industry in the S&P 500 and get much better returns on their capital. One of the prior speakers noted that the energy as a percent of the S&P 500 has gone from around 15% to 2.5% today. That's exactly why.
Yeah, I asked about that early and getting involved in here and about the returns up front, and was told by some of the industry that, yeah, we average it over a 30, 40-year period, but I've not seen that investment return do that. You mentioned you're for this, but with the ifs and buts. I'm rambling. You're saying we're the leading organization that must put together a group for this. We by ourselves, I take it, now this is what I'm understanding what you said, by ourselves, without certain qualifications that we just impose this, it would be almost do nothing, be only 5% of the world's production. But you're saying if we shield that with involving the other states, some other international companies, you're telling us to put together another OPEC to an extent. My question is, how in the heck do we do that as a state?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'd go so far as to call it another OPEC, but I would say a group of interested participants that candidly aren't going to survive long term if you don't do something. And so that's why I say I am not for Texas going out on its own and cutting production. While I think that'd be a wonderfully symbolic gesture, all you're going to do is hurt the state of Texas and disadvantage other states, and advantage other states over Texas. I think we have to use our leadership. We have to use our muscle. Every state has some mechanism by which they can effectively regulate production. And, Canada has shown they've done some things to regulate production. Other big exporting countries like Norway,
Canada's oil and gas is done.
Or federal
Oh my
minerals.
God.
I'm sure there's ways they got up their sleeve to do that. I'm just saying, if you don't figure this out, because of the significance of coronavirus, the massiveness of the demand destruction, and likely the longevity that demand destruction is with us, that this industry domestically will be permanently paralyzed. The capital that was so generous to come into our industry from 2009 or 10 up through last year is not going to come back. They've been fooled once, they've been fooled twice, they're not going to get fooled a third time. So we're left to our own devices here. We have to figure out how to stabilize our industry and stabilize it quickly, or a huge chunk of the domestic industry, not just Texas, is going to be taken out. And when that happens, what's left, the pieces will be picked up by companies like mine. They'll be picked up by companies like other large independents that spoke on the call earlier today. And we'll make a lot of money doing that. But the number of jobs that'll be eliminated because of that, the amount of drilling rigs running in the country because of that will all be very significant. And all those things are going to hurt the industry as a whole, are going to hurt our country, and quite frankly, they're going to hurt our state. So it's not an easy solution. I wish I could tell you, hey, if you do this and this, you got it. This is going to be truly a landmark move if you make it. But I'm arguing the stakes are so high. If you don't, the consequences are going to be perilous.
Thank you for your sobering testimony. It is, and you're saying the time length we have to work this, in your estimates, is about a little over a month to do something different? What?
And he's gone. Can't hear nothing. What in the hell? Hold on one second, guys. Did it freeze? Guys, they're talking, but the sound is out. Who hit the mute? Oh, there it is. They're trying to figure it out. Oh, okay. They're on break, guys. They are on break. So one of the largest investors in oil and gas says oil and gas is a terrible investment. That makes a lot of sense. You're just joining in. They went on break. Something happened with their audio. I think they're trying to fix that right now. So they were talking for a solid minute or two and then realized, oh shit. So hopefully it'll be back up soon. You guys got any questions so far? Feel free to type them in. If you've liked already, thank you. If you haven't, it helps me out a lot. So hopefully we'll get running again soon. Let's see, how many we got to go? That was Will Benlow, I guess his name is. Okay, that was number 24 out of 54 people. So I'm assuming that this will be carried over till tomorrow. I had to guess, guys. So I am not sure. Hang out here. What do you guys think about what he was saying? No, I thought I was in Russia right now. It was pretty communist. It is funny that he's pointing out, yes, we need to cut, but if Texas is the only one that cuts, it puts us at an unfair advantage. So basically, nobody cuts. He pointed out Canada. I know a few people up in Canada would beg to differ on what some of the government has done up there. Guys, if you're on Twitter, check out Anas Alhaji, ANASALHAJJI. Really good information. Go-to source on OPEC and oil economics, stuff like that. Get his handle real quick. Really good guy to follow on Twitter. Follow me too, of course. Be nice of you. There he is in the comment sections. Really good stuff. Let me pull up his good Forbes article to read on him too. You guys got any questions for me? Russia holding their ground in terms of cuts. What background in oil and gas? I've been the nerd in the closet for on and off 10 years now. Research, analyst, you name it. try to operate when possible. One problem with Russia, and it's been brought up today about a lot of Texas fields too, is that it can cause damage to shut the wells in for long periods of time. Russia has more than a few fields like that, and thus they can't just shut in. You saw my one video on Russia too. During the winter time, especially, you have to run oil through the pipelines or the pipelines will burst. So that's another issue with Russia being able to cut a lot. It is interesting though, because right after the deal, the Saudis cut prices by about $4 to Asia and then discussed being able to build up spare capacity to 13 million barrels a day, which, considering it's still a rocky road between them and Russia, I think that was kind of bold on their part. What is up with Ring Energy? Yeah, I've been following Ring Energy. Apparently, they're getting a $52 million, they're getting a valuation based on $52 oil, which is insane. I'd love to know who's buying this deal, because I'd sell them some shit in a heartbeat too.
The feed for this streaming event, brought to you by adminmonitor.com, will begin momentarily. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, they got it back up, guys.
The feed for this streaming event, brought to you by adminmonitor.com, will begin momentarily. Thank you for your patience.
Why do they have a private advertiser?
The feed for this streaming event, brought to you by adminmonitor.com, will begin momentarily. Thank you for your patience. The feed for this streaming event, brought to you by adminmonitor.com, will begin momentarily.
Ooh.
Thank you for your patience.
Okay, we got you, buddy, the first time. You guys got any more questions right now? So we wait. They're on break again. Top viewership worldwide on the Texas proration hearing. United States, 19,000. Korea, 1,080. Canada, 815. United Kingdom, 288. Russian Federation, 283. Huh. Interesting. Figured it'd be bigger, honestly. Only 19,000 people. As far as I know, the 21st. I think that's a loose date, though, so I'd double check. In the next 7 days, nothing happens as far as the state's concerned. The biggest problem with this cut is, like the communists just mentioned, is that if Texas is the only one that does it in the United States, it puts Texas operators at an unfair advantage against other operators. It's kind of like California with their emission laws. It makes it extremely difficult to have certain businesses in California because of those laws. It's the same principle with oil and gas. If Texas forces operators to do certain things, it makes an unfair advantage for other states. And the vast majority of people have been against proration. So we shall see. How long do you think Russia and OPEC can financially hold their ground? They both said they can handle it for a while. Financially, I mean, hell, I think the Saudis, a big thing about the Saudis, they have a lot of money. But the only thing more than money they have is borrowing power, because they can borrow against those reserves. They have trillions of dollars worth of reserves in the ground that they can borrow against. Plus, their budget, when you look at their like fiscal government budget, it isn't a lot. I mean, not a lot at all. If they cut royalty payments to the various family members of the royalty, it goes down even more. So with Russia, I think they're basically the same thing. Not that they can borrow money and stuff like that, but I think they can withstand low prices long term too. And when I say low, I mean 30s, 40s, not 20s. But I will say, people get very, I don't know what's the term of it. They get very creative in bad times. So, I mean, hell, you can scrap a lot. Unlike the United States, they don't have a $1 trillion deficit every year and all that other crap to deal with. They actually get stuff done on the budget, so they can actually handle stuff. But also, Russia's getting a double whammy because all their steel, the crap they export is just industrial stuff. It ain't worth a damn right now. Aluminum's tanked, copper's tanked. I mean, just everything's tanked. So
the feed for this streaming event brought to you by
still on break, guys. And like you said, the 7 days also, Eric, I don't know, man. In 7 days, we could be at $10 oil. The Shell Exxon oil spill. Which one? Like the old one? Yes, the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund has bought Carnival Cruise. They bought Shell, I believe BP. They bought a few companies, but I think they've only bought European countries because they don't want to catch hell in the States because of the laws in the States. 100,000 barrel leak. Shell. Yeah, I didn't even see that. Let's see. Exxon pipeline leak halts some production at Gulf of Mexico facility, Shell says. One thing about these Gulf of Mexico leaks, they thought it was a small leak on the BP oil disaster too. So that stuff you always play out by time. That's the only way you can really tell. If it's only 100,000 barrels and it's shut off now, that's not bad. If it's 100,000 barrels a day, that's insane. Cardito assets. Hoover offshore oil pipeline system. Who are they loaning money to? It's crazy. 100,000 barrels leak and shut down 3 months ago would have been a big deal. Sent oil up. Today, it's like not even a drop in the bucket. There's so much oversupply. Well, Saudi's buying people right now. They have to be very careful because they are the ones that, in fact, kind of tank the market, so to speak. So tanking the world oil markets, and make no mistake, the oversupply was already an issue, but their ramp up to 12 million barrels a day just killed the industry, and then they went back and bought companies after that. So, for them, they have to be careful and not get themselves into legal issues with that, because that's almost not insider trading, but it's market manipulation to profit. Oh, it ain't no coincidence. they sank oil and then went, oh, hey, look, Shell is like 80% down. Oh, what's that? BP, you're down too? Okay, let's pick up some of that. Oh, Carnival Cruise Lines, you're out of work. Let's buy you too. But like I said, they gotta be careful because they've got to be able to get sued for doing that if they don't do it right. And I think that's why they have stayed away from American oil companies, or they just think American oil companies suck, which ExxonMobil's right now they've got $3 billion in cash, which is not a lot of cash at all. EOG's got $2 billion in cash. EOG also only has $5 billion in debt versus ExxonMobil having over $25 billion in debt. So there may be a reason Saudis ain't buying American companies right now. Like the guy just said, Shell's been the biggest loss of capital in the history of capitalism. Or, Enron maybe, but no, it's bigger than Enron. Speaking of EOG, Enron Oil and Gas. Talk about a move them guys getting out. They separated in August of '99. Enron went under, I guess, November, December 2001. Has some old oil history from the 90s. I wonder if they had any idea Enron was crap, and that's why EOG got the hell out of Dodge. They were leaving arguably the top company in the world at the time. It was all fraud. Enron was the top oil company at the time, but they literally separated and went their separate ways when Enron was, quote unquote, the top energy market company in the world. EOG, of course, has become a juggernaut, but I do find the timing interesting that they would leave a quote unquote great company in '99 and then so just over 2 years from the day Enron doors were completely shut and closed, EOG left. And again, who knows? Still no word yet on the meeting, guys. They may be done for the day. There's over 54 people on it.
The feed for this streaming event brought to you by adminmonitor.com.
There's over 54 people on the meeting today. They're at number 24, to give you an idea of how long this is. So this definitely will go tomorrow. I love you guys, but I'm not running this through the night if they try to run. So I hope you've enjoyed my commentary during the breaks and stuff, but I know some people were trying to find the feed, so I just threw it on the live real quick, help you guys out, but I ain't carrying this damn thing all night. Brent, the ICE Brent market just opened up. It is down over 5% already. Yeah, I think Eric, it'll wrap up tomorrow for sure, but I don't want to leave the feed and then they start up again. So I'll wait and hold the feed. I'm doing a 5 p.m. Central Time podcast every day now, Monday through Friday, and then a Q&A on Saturdays. But it may run into it. If not, just kind of go over what they've been talking about today. The general consensus is that most of the big companies are against it. The little companies are for it, kinda. They want it as long as it doesn't hurt them. But as it's been pointed out, the proration would hurt them even more. Big concern lately is that, and you've heard it on here, is that big companies, and this goes back dawn of time. If you got ExxonMobil over here with 1 million barrels, and then you got ABC mom and pop over here with 10,000 barrels, who do you think, the refiners and the buyers are going to mess with? They're going to mess with Exxon. So this argument that the smaller operators aren't able to get their oil to market, this is since the dawn of time in the business. Hell, that's been going on for 10 years up in the Balkan. That's one of the biggest problems up in the Balkan. EOG, speaking of Mark Papa, they built that rail terminal up in the Balkan specifically so they could get their oil to markets, East Coast, West Coast, Gulf. Smart move on Mark Papa's watch to get that rail terminal into Balkan. But the Balkan's notorious. That goes with service companies too. You got Continental up there drilling hundreds, if not thousands of wells. You think they're going to stop a drilling deal to come over and mess with your 2 wells a year? No. This is the oil and gas market. This is what happens. I'm going to do a rundown on Tesla tomorrow at 5 o'clock. If you guys ain't got nothing going on. All right, guys. I'm going to go on and start the podcast, I guess. Oh, shit. Oh, here we go. Never mind.
Be ready to appear 2 speakers ahead of you and to please respect the 3-minute time limit given to speak. There will be a 5 to 20-minute breaks given at different intervals of the meeting where we will pause video and return at the appropriate time to reconvene. If you experience technical difficulty or do not appear when called upon, please send an email to rrcconference@rrc.texas.gov with your name, phone number, and we will have someone assist you with further instructions. The Commission does reserve the right to remove any audio or video sharing capabilities for any person engaging in disorderly conduct while speaking, but I am more than confident in our speakers that we will not have to do that today. With that said, Chairman Christian, if you would, please start the meeting.
This is Chairman Christian. This meeting of the Railroad Commission of Texas will come to order to consider matters which have been duly posted with the Secretary of State for April 14th, 2020. The Commission will consider the items on the agenda as posted on the agenda. And then Commissioner Craddock, would you like to make an opening statement?
You'll need to unmute Commissioner Craddock.
Already messed up when we just started. Good morning and thank you. And thank you.
All right, guys. That is it for the day. So she and Hiddle will be tomorrow. Let's dive into the podcast real quick, guys. Thanks for sticking around. Talk about today, after the bell, Ring Energy announced a ridiculous deal. To give you a breakdown of it, they've got a non-refundable $500,000 deposit on a $31.5 million deal to buy out some assets they have. The PV10 valuation of it is $43 million, and it's at a $52 per barrel oil price. So $43 million is what it's worth at 50-something dollar oil, and this company supposedly is buying at a $31 million price. Ladies and gentlemen, cough, bullshit. That's not happening. Ring Energy shot up like a rocket, and it since came tumbling back down. It was over $1 a share. It's back down to 82 cents. So it's up about 30% now for the day after hours. It was up a lot more, but it's come back down. That deal is crap. Anybody paying that kind of money is an idiot. As you saw today on this, it's been a lot of fun. Been kind of boring. Most people are not for progression, and if they are, they have stated that the only way to do it would be for the entire country to do it somehow. And of course, everybody's saying, but how do we do it? So do not look for it to happen. And yeah, I don't see it happening. Brent crude markets just opened up, down 5%. So that gives you an idea. That's not very good at all. If you guys have any questions for me about any stocks today, I saw the company Scorpio Tankers. They're up about 4% today. I like tankers right now for storage, for moving. Definitely check them out. Pump, if you saw my video, I'm not a fan of Pump. ProPetro service company. I think all service companies are bad right now, no matter how great a company they may have been. With the rig counts dropping, service industry is not where you want to be. I would wait till after second quarter before even looking at service companies, because I think a lot of them will be restructured. And as you know, owning stock in a company is the most vulnerable place you can be in a restructuring market, because you lose everything. So be wary of that. I like EOG, just I don't want to own them yet. I think they still have further to fall after earnings. Like them long term, like Diamondback long term. I do not like Oxy. And also, guys, tomorrow, don't forget, I'm doing a Tesla special at 5 o'clock, provided that the meeting is over. So with that, you guys have any questions for me? And by the way, guys, thank you for all the likes and subscriptions. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them. Leave it in the comment section. If you want a special company request to review, check out Digital Wildcatters. They got a really cool Oxy video. That debacle that happened last year. Warren Buffett gave them $10 billion to help with the acquisition of Anadarko. And now Oxy is worth about $10 billion. So that is wild. That is wild. If you're just joining, commission just recessed for the day. We'll start up again tomorrow. Feel free to go back through the video. I've got names down when they started on here, so you can kind of see when in fact they came on. And I think that's about it, guys. But I appreciate you watching. Please like and share, subscribe. Feel free to comment, even if you hate me. I love to hear it. So, all right, guys, have a good evening.